The station master didn't even look up from his desk. "There's no room here for women like you," he said, sliding her last dollar coin back across the counter like it was something dirty. "Take the child and go wait outside." Outside, in Wyoming, in December, with the temperature already dropping below zero and her daughter's lips turning the faint blue-gray color that mothers recognize before they allow themselves to name it. Clara Whitmore pressed her hand flat against the wooden counter to keep herself from shaking. She had traveled 900 miles on the promise of a man she had never met, and now that man was gone, vanished like smoke, and nobody in this entire town was willing to pretend she existed. She picked up Nora. She walked back out into the cold. And that was the moment a stranger on horseback stopped in front of her and said 4 words that would change both their lives forever. "You'll never sleep outside." If this story moves you, if you've ever been left behind by someone who promised to stay, please hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me the city and country you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it touches your heart, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to where it all began. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, which Clara would later think was fitting because nothing important in her life had ever happened on a Tuesday. Important things happened on Sundays, when the world was watching, or on Fridays, when people were too tired to be careful. Tuesdays were the days when a woman might lower her guard just enough to believe something good was possible. She had read it 4 times standing at the kitchen window of her sister's house in Ohio, where she and Nora had been living for 8 months in a back room barely large enough for a cot and a small chest of drawers. Her sister Ruth loved her. Clara knew that. But Ruth had 3 children of her own, a husband who worked 2 jobs and came home smelling like a man who resented everything he couldn't control, and a house that had never been designed to hold the quiet weight of another woman's failure. That was how Clara had started thinking of herself by then. A failure. Not because she had done anything wrong, exactly, but because the world had a way of making women feel responsible for every disaster that touched them, even the ones they never chose. Her husband, Daniel, had died 18 months earlier. Not nobly. Not in some accident that allowed people to say what a shame and mean it. He had drunk himself into the kind of debt that doesn't stay quiet, and when his heart gave out at 41, what he left behind was not grief so much as a long list of men who wanted to be paid. Clara had sold everything that could be sold. And then she had packed Nora, 4 years old, small for her age, with her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, into 2 bags and knocked on her sister's door. That had been 8 months ago. The letter was from a man named Samuel Voss. He had placed an advertisement in a Cincinnati paper, which was how Clara had found him, or rather, how Ruth's neighbor Mrs. Alderman had found it, and left it folded on Clara's pillow with a note that said simply, "Thought you might want options." She had written to him out of desperation, not hope. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. She had described herself plainly, 28 years old, healthy, accustomed to hard work, with a daughter aged 4 who was well-behaved and would cause no trouble. She had not described herself as beautiful or charming or any of the other qualities she suspected men in Samuel Voss's position were actually hoping for. She had described herself as reliable, which was the truest thing she knew about herself. Samuel Voss had written back within 2 weeks. His letter was not romantic. It was almost businesslike, which Clara had respected. He owned a cattle operation in a place called Red Hollow, Wyoming Territory. He needed someone who could manage the domestic side of the ranch, cooking, organizing, basic record keeping. In exchange, she and her daughter would have a proper room, food, safety, and a share of the operation's modest income. He had used the word partnership 3 times, which she had noticed. She had written back. He had written back. 6 letters over 3 months. Nothing personal. Nothing that would embarrass either of them if read aloud. Just 2 adults making a practical arrangement because the world didn't always give people the luxury of waiting for something better. She had told Nora they were going somewhere new, somewhere with horses and wide open sky. Nora had asked if there would be snow. Claire had said probably yes. Nora had seemed satisfied with that. They had taken the train from Cincinnati to Denver, and then a connecting line north toward the Wyoming Territory. The journey took 4 days. Clara had packed enough food for 3, rationing carefully, letting Nora eat first every time. By the last day, she wasn't hungry anymore. Or rather, she had become so accustomed to the sensation of not eating that she had stopped registering it as hunger, and started registering it simply as the way her body felt now. She was not afraid, or at least she kept telling herself that. She was 28 years old and she had already buried a husband, survived a winter with no income, and lived for 8 months in a room where she could hear through the thin wall every argument her sister and brother-in-law tried to have quietly. Fear required the belief that things could still get significantly worse. Clara had stopped believing in significantly worse. That was a mistake. The train pulled into Red Hollow at 3:30 in the afternoon, and the first thing Clara noticed was how small the station was. A single-room building with a wood stove that was clearly not drawing correctly because smoke was leaking from the pipe joints rather than rising up through the chimney. The second thing she noticed was that there was no one waiting on the platform who looked like he was waiting for anyone. She stood there for 10 minutes with Nora pressed against her side and her suitcase at her feet, watching the few other passengers disperse into town. A couple was met by a man with a wagon. An older woman in a good wool coat was embraced by what appeared to be her daughter. A traveling salesman was already talking loudly to anyone who would listen. Nobody came for Clara. She told herself there had been a delay. A horse that threw a shoe, a fence that needed mending before he could leave the ranch. She told herself 6 reasonable things in 10 minutes and believed none of them completely, but kept holding on to each one in turn because the alternative, allowing herself to stand on this platform and understand what was actually happening, was something her body wasn't ready for yet. She went inside and asked the station master, a thin, sun-dried man with the particular look of someone who had spent decades being mildly irritated, whether a man named Samuel Voss had come through asking for a woman arriving on the afternoon train. The station master looked at her for a moment in a way that told her he already knew something she didn't. "Voss left," he said. "Left where?" "Left." He said it as if the word explained everything, as if the entire geography of gone was contained in that single syllable. "Few weeks back. Packed up his outfit and headed south. Heard he had debts." Clara stood very still. "He left the territory?" "That's what I said. Before I—" She stopped, started again. "Before I arrived." "Appears so." She looked at him for a moment. "I sent him a letter confirming my arrival date. He wrote back." The station master shrugged, not a sympathetic shrug. The kind of shrug that says, "This is your problem, not mine, and I'd like you to take it somewhere else." "Ma'am, I don't know nothing about letters. What I know is Voss is gone and the ranch is sitting empty. Whatever arrangement you had with him is—" He made a gesture with his hand that was somehow more dismissive than any word could have been. "It's done." Nora tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Mama, I'm cold." The wood stove was barely working. The room couldn't have been much above freezing. Clara looked down at her daughter's face and felt something in her chest tighten in a way she recognized. Not panic exactly, but the physical sensation of a door closing. She gathered herself. "Is there an inn in town? A boarding house?" "Doyle's on the main road, but—" He paused, and something in that pause told Clara she didn't want to hear what came next. "Mrs. Doyle doesn't take in—" He seemed to search for the least offensive phrasing and fail. "Unaccompanied women. It's her policy." "I have a child." "I'm aware." "We're not—" She stopped herself before she could say dangerous, which was what she'd been about to say, because the absurdity of needing to clarify that a 28-year-old woman and a 4-year-old girl were not dangerous to a boarding house had not yet fully reached the part of her brain that was still maintaining composure. "We simply need a room for the night, until I can make arrangements." "I can't help you with that," the station master said. And then, and this was the part Clara would remember later, the part that would come back to her in dreams, he slid her single remaining dollar coin back across the counter as if returning something that didn't belong in his space. "There's no room here for women like you," he said. "Take the child and go wait outside." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about how she had been traveling for 4 days, how she had rationed food so Nora could eat, how she had kept herself composed through every mile of uncertainty because she had believed, genuinely believed, that there was something waiting at the end of it. She thought about the 6 letters she had exchanged with Samuel Voss, the careful, practical, reasonable letters, the ones where she had not asked for kindness or romance or rescue, only the bare minimum of reliability. She thought about all of this, and she picked up Nora, picked up her suitcase, and walked back out into the cold without saying a word. Because here was something Clara Whitmore had learned in 28 years. Sometimes the most dignified thing a woman could do was refuse to give a man the satisfaction of her reaction. She would fall apart later, somewhere private, where it counted for something. Right now, she had a daughter to hold. The temperature outside had dropped since they arrived. She could feel it differently now. Not the abstract cold of someone who has been inside and is bracing themselves, but the immediate cold of someone who understood, in a purely physical way, that this was going to become a serious problem within hours. She sat down on the wooden bench along the station's outer wall. She pulled Nora into her lap and wrapped both arms around her and tucked the edge of her own coat around the child's legs. Nora was quiet in that particular way of tired children. Not content, not asleep, just conserving energy in some instinctive animal way. "Are we waiting for Mr. Voss?" Nora asked. "No, sweetheart." "Is he coming?" "No." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Did he forget?" Clara pressed her lips to the top of Nora's head. Something like that. A few townspeople passed. Clara watched each of them with the particular attention of a person who needs help and is trying to determine who might give it. A woman in a heavy shawl glanced at her and then looked away quickly. The look of someone who has identified a problem and decided it's not theirs. Two men walked past talking loudly and didn't appear to see her at all. A young boy stopped and stared at Nora until his mother grabbed his arm and pulled him forward without looking at Clara. She was invisible in the most painful way possible. Not truly unseen, but deliberately unacknowledged. The light was fading. It faded fast here, she realized. Faster than in Ohio, something about the way the mountains cut into the horizon. By 5 o'clock, the sky was already the deep bruised purple of late evening, and the temperature had dropped several more degrees. Nora's lips had taken on a color that Clara did not want to think about directly. She went back inside and tried the station master again. She asked if there was a church that took people in. He said the pastor's house was full since the Hendersons had lost their place last month. She asked if there was anyone who might rent a room, even a storage room, just for the night. He mentioned a woman named Hattie Bryce on the east end of town who sometimes took in boarders, but the way he said sometimes made it clear this was not one of those times. She tried Hattie Bryce anyway, knocked on the door. A woman in her 60s opened it, looked at Clara, looked at Nora, and said she was sorry, but she didn't have the space. The way she said it wasn't unkind. She seemed to mean it. She offered a biscuit from a cloth in her apron pocket, which Nora accepted and which Clara was grateful for in a way that felt close to humiliation. She went back to the bench. The sky was fully dark now. The temperature had stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like something more definitive. The kind of cold that stopped being an inconvenience and started being a statement of intent. Clara was not a dramatic woman. She did not catastrophize. But she was also not an idiot, and she understood the difference between discomfort and genuine danger. And as she sat on that bench with Nora shivering in her arms and the last bit of warmth from the station wall already gone, she understood that she had crossed into the second category some time ago. She had been wrong, she realized. She had thought she had stopped believing in significantly worse. She had been wrong about that. It was at that moment, with Nora's weight against her chest and her own hands going numb inside her gloves, that she heard the sound of hooves on the frozen ground. She didn't look up immediately. A rider passing through was not her concern. Everything that was her concern had already demonstrated that it wasn't going to help her. But the hooves stopped, and a voice, a low, careful voice, the voice of someone who chose words like a man chooses where to put his feet on uncertain ground, said, "Ma'am, how long have you been sitting out here?" Clara looked up. The man on horseback was not remarkable to look at, which was the first thing she noticed. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, weathered in the way of men who spend their days outdoors, wearing a heavy coat and a hat pulled low against the wind. I wasn't looking at her in the way some men looked at women in difficult situations. That assessing, calculating look that told you they were already thinking about what they could get. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a problem they're trying to understand before they speak. He was looking at Nora's lips. "A few hours," Clara said, because lying about it seemed pointless. He swung down from the horse, not dramatically, just efficiently, the movement of someone who had done it 10,000 times. He crouched slightly to be closer to eye level, not so low as to seem theatrical, just enough to not loom. "Is there someone meeting you?" he asked. "No," she said. "There was supposed to be." He left the territory before I arrived. Something moved across his face. Not pity, exactly. Something more complicated than pity. The expression of someone who has heard a specific kind of human story before and has not yet decided how to feel about the particular iteration of it in front of him. Have you tried? I've tried everything in this town, Clara said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. The boarding house won't take unaccompanied women. The station master told me to wait outside. I tried 2 other options. There's nothing left to try. He was quiet for a moment. I have a ranch 6 miles out, he said. Spare room. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and there's food. Clara looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at something when you're trying to determine whether it's safe, except she was aware that she no longer had the luxury of taking the time that question actually required. She was aware that her daughter's body temperature was the most pressing fact in her life at this moment, and that everything else, caution, pride, the reasonable instinct not to follow a stranger into the dark, was a secondary consideration. She hated that it had come to this. She hated it more specifically because she had tried so hard to make sure it wouldn't. I don't know you, she said. No, he agreed. I have no reason to trust you. No, he said again. Not defensively, just acknowledging it. What's your name? Ethan Caldwell. She looked at him for another moment. Nora had gone very still against her chest in the way that children go still when they've given up expecting something to happen. My name is Clara Whitmore, she said. This is my daughter Nora. She's 4 years old and she's cold. I can see that, Ethan Caldwell said quietly. If you take us out to your ranch and there is anything, that is not what you've described, I want you to understand that I will find a way to make that known. Even out here, even with nothing to my name. I have spent my whole adult life making myself be heard in rooms that didn't want to hear me, and I am very good at it. Something that might, in better light, have been the beginning of a very small smile crossed his face and then disappeared before it became anything. You'll never sleep outside, he said. That I can promise you. Clara stood up. She adjusted Nora against her hip. She picked up her suitcase. All right, Mr. Caldwell, she said. Let's go. She followed him into the darkness because there was nothing else to do, and because sometimes the bravest thing a person can manage is simply not standing still. The ride out to Ethan Caldwell's ranch took the better part of an hour, and it was the longest hour Clara could remember in recent memory, which was saying something given the last 18 months of her life. He had offered to let her ride the horse, a big, patient gray animal he called Gus, with Nora in front of her, while he walked alongside. Clara had almost refused on principle, because accepting help had become a reflex she had to consciously override every time, like a door that swings shut on its own and requires deliberate effort to hold open. But Nora's weight against her chest was already making her left arm ache, and the child had stopped shivering, which Clara knew was not actually a good sign. So she had said yes without arguing and handed Nora up first. Ethan walked ahead, leading Gus by the reins, and didn't talk much. That was the first thing Clara noticed about him that she filed away as potentially meaningful. He didn't seem to feel the need to fill silence with sound. Most men she had encountered in difficult situations wanted to explain themselves, justify themselves, tell her their intentions and history and reasons until the talking itself became a kind of pressure. Ethan Caldwell walked through the dark and the cold and said nothing, and somehow the nothing felt more considerate than most people's something. The road, if it could be called that, it was more of a frozen track through scrub grass, wound away from Red Hollow and into the open land that stretched in every direction like something that had been unrolled and forgotten. The sky out here was different from the sky in Ohio. Clara had expected that intellectually, but experiencing it was something else. It was enormous in a way that made her feel both very small and, strangely, slightly less trapped, as if the vastness of it left room for possibilities that smaller skies wouldn't permit. She did not let herself lean too far into that feeling. She had been wrong about possibilities before. Nora fell asleep somewhere in the middle of the ride, her body going the boneless, heavy way of children who have simply decided they're done for the day and the world can manage without them for a while. Clara held her tighter and watched the dark land pass. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked finally, not because she needed to know, but because the silence had started to feel like something she was choosing, rather than something that was simply happening, and she preferred to make deliberate choices when she could. 8 years, Ethan said, without turning around. Alone? A pause. My wife died 4 years back. Fever. I'm sorry. That was all he said. Not thank you, and not it's fine, and not any of the other things people usually said to fill the space after condolences. Just that small, swallowed sound that meant he had heard her and was acknowledging it without wanting to make it into a conversation. Clara understood that impulse completely. I have 2 hands, he added after a moment. Miles Carter and Cole Ramsey. They'll be there when we arrive. I'm telling you so you're not startled. Will they mind? Clara asked. Me being there. Another pause, this one slightly longer. Miles won't. She noticed he didn't say anything about Cole Ramsey. The ranch came into view as a cluster of warm light against the darkness. A main house, a barn, a couple of smaller outbuildings. Nothing about it was impressive. The fence along the drive needed work in at least 2 places she could see, even in the dark, and the barn had what looked like a section of roof patched with wood that didn't quite match the rest. But the lights were on, and light meant warmth, and warmth was the only currency that mattered to Clara right now. A man came out onto the porch as they rode up. He was somewhere around 50, broad in the shoulders but soft around the middle in the way of men who had been very strong and were gradually becoming something else. And he had a face that arranged itself naturally into an expression of mild welcome. This, Clara gathered, was Miles Carter. Well, Miles said, looking at Clara and the sleeping Nora with an expression of genuine surprise and equally genuine lack of hostility. Wasn't expecting company. She was at the station, Ethan said simply. Voss situation. Miles's expression shifted slightly, the surprise giving way to something more knowing and more rueful. Voss. He said the name the way you say the name of something that has disappointed you enough times that the disappointment itself has become routine. Right. He stepped off the porch. Here, let me take the little one. You look like your arms are about done. Clara tightened her hold instinctively, and Miles stopped immediately, hands raised slightly. No pressure, he said, just offering. She made herself loosen her grip. She made herself let Miles Carter, who she had known for approximately 15 seconds, lift her sleeping daughter off the horse, because she was tired and her arms were done, and sometimes being a good mother meant letting someone else carry the child for 30 feet. She's heavier than she looks, Clara said, because she needed to say something. They always are, Miles said, with a warmth that didn't seem performed. Come on inside, there's stew on. She climbed down from Gus with less grace than she would have liked. Her legs had gone partially numb from the ride, and one of them buckled slightly when it hit the ground, and she grabbed the saddle to catch herself. Ethan was there immediately, one hand at her elbow, but he let go the moment she was steady and didn't say anything about it, which she was grateful for. The inside of the main house was warm in the specific way of a space that has been heated by a wood stove over many hours, a deep, even warmth that settled into your bones rather than just touching the surface of your skin. The kitchen took up most of the main floor, with a table big enough for 4, a stove that was clearly the center of operations, and shelves along one wall that held supplies in a state of organization that someone had intended to be systematic and had then gradually allowed to become only approximately systematic. A second man was sitting at the table, a tin mug in both hands, watching her come in with an expression that communicated absolutely nothing useful. This would be Cole Ramsey. He was younger than Miles by maybe 10 years, lean in a way that suggested efficiency rather than deprivation, with the particular stillness of someone who had trained himself not to react to things until he'd decided how he felt about them. He did not stand up. He did not say hello. He looked at Clara, then at the sleeping Nora in Miles's arms, and then back at Clara. "Who's this?" he said. Not rudely exactly, but not warmly. "Clara Whitmore," Clara said before Ethan could speak. "My daughter is Nora. We arrived in Red Hollow today, and the man I had an arrangement with left the territory without notice. Mr. Caldwell offered us shelter for the night." Cole looked at Ethan. Did he? "She'll take the spare room," Ethan said. "Her and the girl." "That's your call," Cole said, and lifted his mug and drank from it and looked away, which was his entire contribution to the welcome. Miles had set Nora down carefully on a folded blanket near the stove, and the child had not woken up, which was remarkable given everything, but exhaustion in small children was its own kind of force. Miles straightened up and looked at Clara. "Sit down before you fall down," he said kindly. She sat. The stew was venison, she thought, with root vegetables and something that had been a biscuit in a previous life now dissolved into the broth. She ate 2 bowls of it without stopping and was halfway through a third before she registered that she was eating it and made herself slow down. Nora woke up briefly, enough to be guided to the table and fed half a bowl while still mostly asleep, and then Miles carried her down the short hallway to the spare room, and Clara followed and watched him lay her daughter on a real bed with a real blanket, and something happened in Clara's chest that she was not going to examine too closely right now. "She'll be all right," Miles said quietly from the doorway. "I know," Clara said. She didn't sleep much. She lay on the outside edge of the narrow bed with Nora tucked against the wall and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind working itself up outside and thought about Samuel Voss, somewhere south of here, who had taken her careful letters and her careful hope and her daughter's one chance at something stable and simply walked away from it. She thought about what she was going to do tomorrow and the day after that, and whether there was a way to get back to Ohio with the money she didn't have. She thought about the station master sliding that dollar coin across the counter. She thought about Miles Carter saying, "Sit down before you fall down," and the particular quality of his voice when he said it, which was the voice of someone who had learned that kindness was most useful when it was matter of fact. Eventually she slept. Morning came hard and cold and bright, the way Wyoming mornings apparently came, with no gentle gradation from dark to light, but rather a sudden hard clarity as if the sun had simply decided to stop being subtle. Clara was up before Nora woke, which was habit from years of being the first one up, and she went to the kitchen and found it empty but with the stove banked and coffee on, which told her that Ethan or one of the others had been up well before her. She poured a cup and stood at the window and looked at the ranch in daylight for the first time. It was, in daylight, more complicated than it had appeared the night before. The land itself was significant. She couldn't estimate acreage well, but it stretched further than she could see in several directions. The main pasture held maybe 24 cattle, which she knew enough to recognize were not as many as the land could probably support. The barn was larger than she'd realized, though the patched section of roof was more obvious now. It had clearly been done quickly, with whatever was on hand, and would need proper attention before another hard winter. There was a chicken coop and a kitchen garden, the latter now mostly frozen, and showing the evidence of not having been properly put to bed before the cold hit. She was cataloging all of this, filing it away in the part of her brain that automatically assessed what needed doing in any space she occupied, when Ethan came through the back door and stopped slightly when he saw her at the window. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." She held up the coffee pot in a gesture that asked if he wanted some, and he nodded and she poured him a cup, and for a moment they were just 2 people in a kitchen in the early morning, which was the most ordinary thing in the world, and felt, to Clara, almost unbearably strange. "I need to ask you something," she said when he'd sat down. "All right. I can't go back to Ohio." She said it flatly, because the flat truth was kinder than a gentle approach to it. "I don't have money for the train. And there isn't anything to go back to. My sister's house was temporary. It was always temporary." Ethan looked at his coffee. "I'm not asking you to take on Samuel Voss's arrangement," she said. "I understand that's not what you offered. I'm asking if there's work here. Any work. Whatever needs doing. I'll earn our keep and I'll save what I can, and eventually I'll have enough to find something else. I'm not asking for charity." Ethan was quiet long enough that Clara had time to regret how she'd phrased the last sentence, because "I'm not asking for charity" sounded like she was criticizing the hospitality he had already shown her, which was not her intention at all. "The last person who did the cooking here was my wife," he said finally. "Before that it was Miles's mother, who lived with us the first 2 years. Since then it's been whoever's turn it is, and coal burns everything, and Miles is decent, but he resents it." Clara waited. "The record-keeping's a mess," he continued. I'm better on the land than I am with paper, and the garden's been let go, and there's a dozen other things that have been let go because there are only so many hours and only so many hands." "That's yes?" Clara said. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the preparation for one. "That's yes." She nodded once. "I'll need to know where everything is. And I'll need Nora to be able to stay where she can see me, at least until she's settled. She doesn't do well when she can't see me. That's fine. And I want it clear to your men that I'm working, not being kept. I won't have anyone thinking I'm dependent on this household in a way that gives them the right to have opinions about my presence here. He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd started speaking. Cole Ramsey has opinions about everything, he said. I can't promise he won't voice them. What I can promise is that he works for me, and I'll make sure he understands what that means. It was not a perfect guarantee. Clara knew what men like Cole Ramsey were like well enough to know that a word from the employer only managed so much. But it was honest, and honesty was rarer than comfort, and she had learned to value it more. All right, she said. Nora appeared in the doorway, still in yesterday's clothes, her hair a catastrophe, holding the corner of the blanket she'd apparently dragged from the bed. She looked at Ethan with the uncomplicated assessment of a 4-year-old. Are you the cowboy? She asked. Ethan looked at her. I suppose so, he said. Nora considered this. You have a horse named Gus. I do. Can I see him? After breakfast, Clara said firmly. Nora came to the table and climbed onto a chair and looked around the kitchen as if taking ownership of it in some fundamental 4-year-old way. It smells like wood, she said. Most things out here do, Miles said, appearing from outside still pulling his coat off, and he grinned at Nora with the ease of a man who had either raised children or spent enough time around them to stop finding them unpredictable. You're awake. Good. You hungry? Yes, Nora said with great seriousness. Miles looked at Clara. She always this direct? Unfortunately, Clara said, and poured her daughter a cup of warm water from the kettle. Those first days were not easy ones. Clara had told herself they wouldn't be, and she'd been right. But there's a difference between knowing a thing and living inside it. She didn't know where anything was in this kitchen, which meant that cooking a meal took twice as long as it should, while she opened every cabinet and drawer and reorganized as she went. Which meant dinner was late the first night, and Cole ate his in silence, and with a face that communicated precisely how he felt about that. She burned the biscuits on the second morning because the stove ran hotter than any stove she'd used before, and she hadn't adjusted her timing. Nora, helpfully, pointed this out by saying, Mama, they're brown, and Miles had laughed, a real laugh, the involuntary kind. And Cole had looked at his plate as if the situation was a personal affront to him. I'll have it figured out by the end of the week, Clara told Cole directly, because ignoring him felt worse than addressing him. Cole looked up at her. That right? He said. Not a question. Yes. You figure out what you're doing with the records too? Because they're behind about 3 weeks and Ethan's got a meeting with the land office in 2 months. She hadn't known about the land office meeting, but she kept her face neutral. Show me what you have and I'll tell you what I need. Cole studied her for a moment in that evaluating way of his. Then he pushed back from the table and went to a box on the shelf and dropped it in front of her without ceremony. Inside was a collection of papers, receipts, tallies, letters, some folded and some crumpled, in an order that Clara would have described charitably as thematic and uncharitably as chaotic. Take your time, he said, which, from Cole Ramsey, she was beginning to understand, was the closest thing to encouragement he was capable of. She spent 2 evenings at the table with that box while Nora slept, and the men did whatever they did in the evenings. Miles played cards with himself, which she found both sad and oddly endearing. Ethan read, slowly, the way a man reads when he learned to read as an adult, and never quite lost the sense of it as an accomplishment. Cole went outside and didn't explain where, and she didn't ask. By the end of the second evening, she had the papers sorted and dated and organized into 3 categories and had identified 7 discrepancies in the cattle tallies that appeared to be simple miscounting but needed to be verified. She set the organized papers on Ethan's chair so he'd find them in the morning, and she went to bed, and she didn't feel proud of herself exactly, but she felt something, a sense of occupation, of purpose, of her own usefulness in a space that had needed her particular kind of usefulness, which was different from being grateful for rescue and different from owing anything to anyone. It was closer to belonging, which was a thing she had stopped believing she was capable of feeling. Nora discovered the horses on the 3rd day. Or more precisely, Nora discovered Gus, and Gus apparently decided that Nora was acceptable, which Clara gathered from Miles was not guaranteed because Gus had strong opinions about people and usually expressed them by refusing to be approached. Nora had walked up to Gus's stall in the barn with the fearlessness of a child who doesn't know enough to be afraid yet, and Gus had lowered his big gray head and sniffed her, and Nora had said, "Hello, your name is Gus," and that had been that. Miles found the two of them standing there and came and got Clara. "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it," he said, in genuine wonderment. Clara stood in the barn doorway and watched her daughter stroke the horse's nose with both hands, talking to him with great seriousness about something Clara couldn't quite hear. She felt that tightening in her chest again. "She's been afraid of most things since her father died," Clara said, without planning to. "Loud noises, strangers, new rooms." She paused. "Horses apparently are different." Miles nodded slowly. "Animals know things," he said, with the quiet conviction of someone who had spent enough time around both animals and people to have reached a conclusion about which was more reliable. What Clara did not expect was Cole. She had categorized Cole Ramsey by the end of the first week as a permanent negative. Not hostile exactly, not the kind of man who would actively create problems, but not someone who was going to make her feel welcome or accepted or anything other than provisionally tolerated. She had decided this was something she could live with because she had lived with worse and because the job she was doing was good work, and that was what mattered. Then on the 8th day, she overheard him. She had gone to the barn to call Nora in for lunch, and she stopped before she rounded the corner of the stall because she heard Cole's voice, and the oddity of his tone made her pause. It was different from his usual voice, quieter, and without the layer of dry assessment that colored everything he said. He was talking to Nora, not in the stiff, slightly pained way of a man who doesn't know children and is doing his best. He was talking to her the way you talk to a small person whose intelligence you take seriously. "No, see, you hold the brush like this, flat against your palm. Then you go with how the hair grows, not against it. Gus will tell you if you're going the wrong way. He'll shift his weight, like that. See how he did that? That means you went the wrong direction." "He talked to me?" Nora said. "That's how he talks. Not with words, but yeah." "How do you know what he means?" A pause. "You practice. You pay attention. It's like anything. You learn the language if you spend enough time." Clara stood very still in the barn doorway and did not make a sound. "Cole," Nora said, in her serious 4-year-old way, "do you have a little girl?" A longer pause. "No," Cole said. "Do you have a little boy?" "No." "Oh." Nora considered this. "That's okay. You can practice with me." Clara went back to the kitchen and stood there for a moment and looked at the wall. Then she started cutting bread for lunch and didn't say anything to anyone. It was around the second week that Victor Hale first appeared, and he appeared in the way that men like Victor Hale generally appeared in Clara's experience of the world, through other people, which is to say through rumors and glances and the particular quality of tension that entered a room when his name came up, before she had ever laid eyes on the man himself. She heard his name first from Miles, who mentioned it in the context of a fence line dispute that had apparently been ongoing for years. Then she heard it again from a woman named Agnes Petty, who came out from town in a wagon to trade dried goods, and who, over the course of a 2-hour visit that Clara found enormously useful because Agnes Petty clearly knew everything about everyone within 30 miles, explained that Victor Hale owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, that he had been trying to acquire Ethan Caldwell's land for the better part of 3 years, that there was a water source on Ethan's property that fed into 3 other streams, and that Hale was the kind of man who treated patience as a weapon. "Ethan won't sell," Agnes said, drinking her coffee. "Doesn't matter what Hale offers. This place was his father's." "And Hale knows that?" Clara asked. "Oh, Hale knows that. That's why he doesn't offer anymore." Agnes looked at her over the rim of her cup. "He waits for problems, and he creates them when they don't come on their own." Clara filed this away. She met Victor Hale himself on a Thursday, the 15th day of her time at the ranch, when he rode up the drive in the middle of the afternoon with 2 men behind him who had the specific look of men hired to stand near someone and be large. Clara was in the yard with Nora when they arrived, hanging washing on the line that she'd strung between 2 posts because there had been no clothesline and there needed to be one. She straightened up and turned and looked at the 3 riders and recognized immediately, in the way that some people are immediately recognizable, that the man in front was the one whose face she needed to read carefully. Victor Hale was not a large man, which surprised her. She had assembled, from the various ways people said his name, The impression of someone physically imposing. He wasn't. He was probably 50, maybe 55, compact and neat in a way that communicated deliberateness. His coat was expensive and unmuddied, which in Wyoming in December meant he had either changed it before coming or had someone else doing things that would dirty it. He had a broad, pleasant, completely unreadable face and the kind of smile that activated his mouth before it reached his eyes, and then didn't quite reach his eyes at all. He looked at Clara with a smile exactly like that. "Didn't know Caldwell had a woman on the place," he said pleasantly. "Good afternoon," Clara said. "Victor Hale. I have the operation about 4 miles east." He said it the way people say things they expect to land with weight. "And you are?" "Clara Whitmore. I work here." Something shifted fractionally in his face. Not enough to be called an expression, exactly. Just a slight recalibration, the look of a man who has registered a piece of information and is deciding what to do with it. "Work here," he repeated. "That's right." "Doing what?" Clara looked at him calmly. "Whatever needs doing." His smile widened slightly, which did not make it warmer. "Is Caldwell around?" "He's on the south pasture. Miles can ride out and get him if it's important." "I'll wait," Hale said, and looked around the yard with the leisurely attention of someone estimating the value of everything he sees. She didn't go inside and leave him there. She went back to hanging the washing because she had started a task and she was going to finish it, and because she was not going to let a man she'd met 45 seconds ago rearrange her afternoon with the simple pressure of his presence. Nora, who had been playing near the porch, came over and stood next to Clara and watched the visitors with frank curiosity. "Who's that man?" she asked, at a volume that was certainly audible to the man in question. "That's Mr. Hale," Clara said. "We're going to finish this and then go inside and have a biscuit." "Okay," Nora said. Victor Hale watched the exchange with that unchanging, pleasant expression. When Ethan came up from the south pasture, Clara was inside and had her ear to what was happening through the kitchen window, which was open half an inch despite the cold because she had opened it herself when she heard hoofbeats. She could not hear everything. The wind took parts of it, but she heard enough. She heard Hale's pleasant voice explaining that he was concerned about the stability of the Caldwell operation, that there were questions in the community about the situation on the ranch, that a woman whose position wasn't clear could create, well, complications. Legally speaking, she heard Ethan's voice, lower, harder to catch, saying something that included the phrase, "none of your concern." She heard Hale say, still pleasantly, that he hoped Ethan would think carefully, that the land office was going to have questions, that a man with a complicated household arrangement and behind-dated records. She heard Ethan say, "Get off my land," which she could hear very clearly. She heard hoofbeats leaving. Then she heard the door open and Ethan come inside, and he stopped when he saw her at the window, and there was a moment where they both knew that she had heard most of it, and neither of them said so. "He's been trying to take this property for 3 years, Clara said. Ethan looked at her. "Agnes Petty talks too much." "Agnes Petty talks exactly the right amount," Clara said. "What's the issue with the land office meeting?" He pulled his coat off and hung it without answering immediately, which she was starting to recognize as his way of deciding how honest to be about something. "The water rights on the south end aren't fully documented," he said finally. "My father had an arrangement with the previous land officer. The man retired 3 years ago, and his replacement, he wants everything in writing, which is, I've been trying to get it sorted, but the paperwork is complicated, and I've been behind on the records," Clara said. He looked at her. "Yes." She turned back to the window for a moment. She thought about the box of papers she'd spent 2 evenings organizing. She thought about the 7 discrepancies she'd identified. She thought about what Agnes Petty had said about Victor Hale and patience as a weapon. "I need to see everything you have related to the water rights," she said. "Every letter, every record, every receipt. Whatever existed between your father and the old land officer and whatever's happened since." "Clara, I know what you're going to say," she said. "You're going to say this isn't my problem, and I don't need to involve myself in it." He was quiet. "But I was going to be the reason this was complicated," she said. "He was going to use me, my presence here, my unclear position, to create the confusion he needed. I heard him say it, so I am involved in it whether either of us chose that or not." She paused. "And I'm very good with paper." Ethan looked at her for a long time with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not quite appreciation, not quite something else, but somewhere in that territory, alongside something that might have been the quiet recognition of one stubborn person for another. "I'll get the box," he said. It took her 4 days of evenings, after Nora was asleep and the men had gone to their rooms, working at the kitchen table by lamplight, until her eyes hurt. She went through everything Ethan had, which was more than he'd thought, because the relevant papers were mixed in with years of other records, and finding them required reading everything, which meant understanding the entire history of the ranch's operation in a way she hadn't expected. What she found, slowly, was the shape of a life. His father's handwriting in the early records, bigger and less careful than Ethan's, the writing of a man who had more energy than patience. The gradual appearance of Ethan's own handwriting, tentative at first and then more confident. A gap of several months where there were almost no records at all, which corresponded with what she calculated would have been the year his wife died. She noticed the gap and felt something about it that she made herself set aside, because this was not the time. She found the water rights documentation on the 5th evening, not in the main box, but in a separate smaller box at the back of a cabinet shelf that Ethan had forgotten about because he'd packed it when he moved things to make room for her supplies and hadn't opened it since. Inside was a folded letter from the previous land officer, dated 11 years earlier, that set out the water rights arrangement in language that was less formal than modern documentation, but entirely clear in its intent. She read it 3 times. She went and knocked on the door of the room where Ethan was, which she had never done before. He opened it immediately, which meant he'd still been awake. He looked at the paper in her hand. She held it out without preamble. He read it. She watched his face. "This is what you needed," she said, "for the land office. This is the original documentation." He looked up at her. "Where was this?" "Back cabinet, a small box. You'd moved it when you reorganized the storage." He looked down at the paper again, and she watched something move through him. Relief, and something complicated underneath the relief, and something underneath that which she wasn't going to name. "I didn't know this still existed," he said. "It did," she said. "It just needed someone to look for it." He folded the paper carefully and held it, and they stood in the hallway outside his door in the dim light, and the wind outside was doing what Wyoming wind apparently did at night, which was make its presence known in a way that sounded almost deliberate. "Clara," he said, "I don't—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not good at this." "At what?" "Saying things. That should be said." She looked at him. "You don't need to say anything," she said. "This is what I do. This is what I'm here for." She paused. "That's enough." She went back to the kitchen and collected her papers and went to bed. But she lay awake in the dark for a while, with Nora's warm weight beside her, and thought about the particular weight of the word enough. How it could mean barely sufficient, or how, in different circumstances, it could mean exactly right. She fell asleep before she decided which she'd meant. Miles found her at the kitchen window the next morning, drinking her coffee in the early quiet, and he stood beside her and looked out at the frost on the ground and the cattle moving in the far pasture, and he said without preamble, "You know, when he brought you back here that first night, I thought he'd made a mistake." Clara said nothing. "Not because of you," Miles added quickly. It's complicated. A woman alone, a child. The ranch has enough trouble without adding, Hale's always looking for an angle, and—" He stopped, looked at his coffee. "I was wrong." Clara turned to look at him. "You reorganized my entire storage system," he said, "and I'm not even mad about it. That's how I know." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother's recipe for sourdough, is it in those papers you have in the back of your bag, or did you memorize it?" He stared at her. "How did you know about that?" "The corner of a paper was sticking out. I didn't read it. I just noticed it was there." She turned back to the window. "If you want to teach me the bread recipe, I'll teach Nora to say good morning to you in French, which is something my grandmother taught me and which I haven't been able to use in about 10 years. Miles was quiet for a moment. "Deal," he said, and held out his hand, and Clara shook it. Outside, across the frost-hard yard, she could see Cole Ramsey walking toward the barn with Nora trotting beside him at a pace that was clearly her maximum trotting speed, her small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers, talking to him with the intensity of a child who is determined that this large, quiet person is an acceptable recipient of her very important thoughts about horses. Cole was not looking at her. He was looking at the barn, but he wasn't walking faster than she could keep up. Clara watched them and thought about things that had not been here 15 days ago and were here now. She thought about the word enough again. It was beginning to feel like it might mean the second thing. The water rights document changed something in the household's atmosphere, though Clara couldn't have explained exactly how or why. It wasn't that anyone celebrated. There was no announcement, no gathering around the table where Ethan held up the paper and made a speech. That wasn't how this household worked, and Clara was grateful for that, because she had lived through enough false celebrations in her life, moments dressed up as victories that turned out to be only brief pauses before the next difficulty, to be suspicious of anything that looked too much like an ending. What changed was smaller and more durable than celebration. Ethan looked at her differently, not in the way that made her uncomfortable, nothing like that, but in the way of a man who has reassessed something and is now operating from a new calculation. Like he had kept her at a certain careful distance, the way you keep a flame at a distance when you're not sure yet how hot it burns, and had now moved slightly closer and found the heat to be something he could stand near. Cole said nothing, but 3 days after she found the document, he repaired the clothesline post that had been leaning since she'd arrived, the one she'd mentioned to no one but had been working around. She came out in the morning and it was fixed, standing straight in the frozen ground, with a new cross brace at the base. He was already in the barn when she found it, and she didn't go in and mention it, and neither did he. And that was, she was beginning to understand how Cole Ramsey expressed things. December deepened into the kind of cold that stopped being a weather event and became simply the condition of existence. The sky above the valley was a flat, indifferent white most days, the kind of sky that didn't invite looking up at it. The cattle moved less, burning their energy for warmth rather than foraging, and Ethan and Miles spent longer hours checking the fences and breaking ice on the water troughs, coming inside in the evenings with the slow, effortful movement of men who have spent their bodies entirely and have nothing left but the habit of continuing. Clara kept the stove going all day. She had figured out, by now, its particular character, the way it ran hotter on the left side, the way it needed to be fed every 2 hours, or it went sullen and stingy with its heat, the way a particular knocking sound from the pipe meant it was drawing well, and a different sound meant it wasn't. She had learned it the way she'd always learned things, by paying attention until the thing revealed its own logic. She'd also, somewhere in the second week, begun reorganizing the food stores in a way that made them last longer and waste less. Not dramatically, she didn't announce it or ask permission. She simply noticed what was being used in what order and what was sitting untouched and going bad. And she adjusted. Miles noticed and said so. Cole didn't notice, or if he did, said nothing. Ethan noticed and thanked her in that quiet, slightly formal way he had, as if gratitude was something he offered carefully because he'd been taught it should mean something. Nora had by this point thoroughly colonized the barn. This was not something Clara had planned or anticipated. She had expected Nora's attachment to Gus to remain a gentle thing, a daily visit, a bit of brushing under supervision, the kind of limited relationship that a 4-year-old maintains with animals before she gets bored and moves on to the next thing. What she had not accounted for was Nora's specific personality, which did not do limited relationships. By the 3rd week, Nora knew the name of every horse in the barn, the name Ethan had given them and the name she had given them, which were different. She knew which ones liked their nose scratched and which ones didn't. She knew that the old brown mare called Della got anxious when thunder came through and needed to hear a calm voice. She knew that the youngest horse, a 2-year-old bay that Miles called Copper, was easily startled and needed to be approached from the left because of something that had happened before they'd had him. She had learned all of this from Cole. Clara had watched this happen with the particular attention of a mother who sees something unexpected developing in her child and isn't sure yet whether to be concerned or grateful. What she concluded over the course of those weeks was that Cole Ramsey with Nora was essentially a different person from Cole Ramsey with everyone else. Not warmer, exactly, not suddenly softer, but more patient, and patient in a way that didn't seem like an effort, which meant it was coming from somewhere real. She never asked him about it. Some things were better left unremarked. It was Miles who eventually told her, on a cold evening when Nora was asleep, and Ethan had gone out to check on something, and it was just the two of them at the table with their coffee, that Cole had lost a daughter. 4 years ago, fever, same winter that had taken Ethan's wife. The girl had been 3 years old. Clara sat with that for a while. He's never said anything, she said finally. Cole doesn't say things, Miles said. He just carries them. She thought about that. She thought about a man who had decided that the safest thing to do with grief was to become the kind of person no one got too close to, because closeness was how you ended up with things you couldn't afford to lose. She thought about how 4 years of that kind of self-protection would wear a person smooth and flat, like a stone in a river, until the protection and the person had become the same thing. She thought about Nora telling Cole that it was okay. He could practice with her. Does Ethan know? She asked. Ethan knows everything about this place, Miles said. Just doesn't usually say it either. Clara nodded and drank her coffee and didn't say anything else, because what was there to say that wouldn't diminish it? The trouble with Victor Hale arrived in two forms, almost simultaneously, which Clara would later think was not a coincidence. Men like Victor Hale did not stumble into their strategies. They engineered them, and the engineering included timing. The first was a letter, which arrived on a Tuesday, her second consequential Tuesday in Wyoming, delivered by a rider Clara didn't recognize who handed it to Ethan at the fence line and rode off before anything else could be exchanged. Ethan brought it inside and read it at the table, and the reading of it changed the set of his jaw in a way that Clara had come to recognize as his specific response to certain kinds of difficulty. Not anger exactly, but the look of a man who has been trying to hold something steady and has just discovered the ground under it is less stable than he'd believed. He set the letter on the table. The land office meeting has been moved up, he said. 6 weeks from now. There will be a formal review of all water rights claims in the valley. Clara put down what she was doing. Why moved up? Letter doesn't explain, just says the schedule changed. He paused. There's a process now. Any claim that can't produce original documentation in proper form will be reviewed for possible reassignment. Clara looked at the letter. She picked it up and read it herself, which she did without asking because it seemed like the kind of moment where asking permission would slow things down unnecessarily. The letter was formal, dry, and careful in its language in a way that, to Clara's eye, suggested it had been drafted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing with formal, dry, careful language. The signature at the bottom was from the land officer, a man named R.T. Marsh. But the language didn't feel like a bureaucrat's language. It felt like a lawyer's language. It felt like the language of someone who had been consulted. Victor Hale has a lawyer, she said. Ethan looked at her. The phrasing here, she said, setting the letter down and tapping a specific paragraph. This part about proper form and documentation standards. That's not how a land officer writes. That's how someone writes when they want to create a threshold that only certain people can clear. She paused. He's not just waiting anymore. He's creating the complication he needed. The second thing arrived 3 days later, and this one was not a letter. Agnes Petty came out from town again, and this time her visit was not the comfortable trading goods kind. She arrived tightly wound in a way Clara hadn't seen before, and she sat down at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "There are people in town saying things about this household." Clara set the kettle on. "What people?" "The Hendersons, Mary Bergen, some others." Agnes looked uncomfortable, which was not a state that suited her face. "They're saying that having a woman here in this situation reflects poorly on the ranch, that it's irregular, and that if the water rights are reviewed and there are questions about the management of the property." She stopped. "I'm not saying this to upset you. I'm saying it because you need to know what's going around." "Victor Hale," Clara said. "He had dinner at the Hendersons last week," Agnes confirmed. Clara poured the hot water into the cups and thought about this. Victor Hale had looked at her across the yard 3 weeks ago and done that fractional recalibration, and she had understood in that moment that she had become part of his calculation. She just hadn't known yet exactly how. Now she did. He was going to use her presence, her lack of formal standing, her ambiguous position, the fact that she was a woman alone with a child living in a widower's house without a clear legal arrangement, to suggest that the ranch's management was unstable, irregular, not the kind of operation a land officer should be assigning long-term water rights to. He wasn't going to attack Ethan's character directly. He was going to create a cloud of implication and let it settle where it would. She sat down across from Agnes. "What do I need to do to make my position here formal?" she asked. "Legally. A work contract, a formal employment arrangement, something with my name and what I do here and what I'm paid." Agnes thought about this. "There's a notary in Red Hollow," Pete Calloway. If you have a document, he witnesses it, it carries legal weight. Can I write it myself? Pete Calloway's not picky about who writes it, Agnes said. He's picky about his fee, though. How much? Agnes named a number that was not large but was larger than what Clara had on hand, because what Clara had on hand was approximately nothing. She had spent the last of her money on the train to a man who was no longer in the territory. She didn't look at Ethan, who was standing near the window. I'll pay Calloway, Ethan said. That's... Clara started. It's practical, he said. Not charity. If the contract makes the position formal, it makes the ranch's management look stable, which is what we need for the land office review. He said it in a flat, reasonable tone, the tone of a man who is explaining why something makes sense because he suspects the other person might resist it if it seems like generosity. Clara recognized the tactic because she used it herself sometimes. All right, she said. Agnes nodded. I'd do it soon. This week, Clara said. She spent that evening writing the contract. She was not a lawyer and had no training in legal language, but she had read enough documents over the years. Her husband's debt papers, her sister's tenancy agreement, the letters with Samuel Voss, to understand the basic structure of what such a thing needed to say. It needed to state who she was and what her role was, and that the arrangement was a formal employment rather than anything else. It needed to be specific about what she did, which meant listing it, which she did in full. Management of household operations, preparation of meals, maintenance of supply records and financial ledgers, organization of documentation, care and maintenance of the kitchen garden, management of preservation and stored goods. She added a line about wages, a small amount, one she had calculated against what the ranch's records suggested it could sustain. And then she looked at that line for a while. Then she rewrote it slightly to specify that the wages would be held in account against future agreement, which was a careful way of saying she would take them when the ranch could afford them and not before, and which she told herself was practical and not sentimental. She brought the document to Ethan in the morning. He read it without speaking. When he got to the wages line, he stopped. This isn't, he started. It's practical, she said, using his own word from the night before, and she saw something in his face that was almost a full expression, which for Ethan Caldwell was the equivalent of a dramatic reaction. He signed it. They went to Red Hollow on Thursday, Clara and Ethan in the wagon, Nora between them on the bench because Nora had made it known in the particular 3-year-old way that she was coming and the discussion was closed. Pete Calloway was a round, fastidious man with a magnificent mustache who read the contract slowly, asked 2 clarifying questions about the wages provision, made a notation in his ledger, stamped the document, and handed it back. The whole thing took 14 minutes. On the way back to the ranch, Nora fell asleep against Clara's arm. Ethan drove and didn't say anything for a while, and then he said, "You didn't have to do the wages the way you did." "I know," Clara said. Silence. "Why did you?" he asked. She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because this place is struggling," she said, "and I am. I'm part of this place now, whether that was the plan or not." She paused. "Taking money out of a place you're part of when it can't afford it is not something I'm willing to do." Ethan looked at the road ahead. His hands on the reins were steady, the way his hands always were, the hands of a man who had been doing physical work since he was young enough that the steadiness had become structural rather than cultivated. "My wife used to say that I was bad at accepting things," he said after a while. "Help. From people." Clara looked at the frozen road ahead of them. "What did you say when she said that?" "That I was fine with accepting things when they made sense." "And she said?" The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. "She said that was the problem." Clara thought about a woman who had known this man well enough to see that particular pattern and name it. She thought about what it must have been like to lose someone who saw you that clearly. "She sounds like she was smart," Clara said. "She was smarter than me," Ethan said plainly, without any performance of false modesty. "By a considerable margin. I knew that when I married her." "Is that why you married her?" He thought about it, which she respected. She had learned that Ethan took questions seriously rather than answering them reflexively. "Partly," he said. "I also married her because she laughed at things other people didn't think were funny, and because she told me the truth even when I didn't want it." Clara said nothing. There was nothing to add to that wouldn't diminish it. They drove the rest of the way back in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The weather changed 2 weeks before the land office meeting. Clara felt it coming before she could have explained why. Something in the quality of the air, a particular stillness that settled over the ranch in the early morning of a Monday that felt different from the stillness of just cold. By afternoon, the sky had taken on a specific yellow-gray color that Miles looked at and called a mother of a storm, and that Ethan looked at and said nothing about, but whose expression communicated that he agreed with Miles's assessment. They spent the rest of that day preparing. The cattle were moved to the lower pasture closest to the ranch. Feed and water were stocked inside the barn. Cole checked and rechecked the barn structure, this was the problem, the thing they all knew and didn't say directly, not in perfect condition. The patched section of roof that Clara had noticed on her first morning was only the most visible issue. The east wall had a section that Miles called honest about its age, which Clara translated as it had been repaired enough times that the repairs were now themselves in need of repair. "Will it hold?" she asked Miles, while Ethan and Cole were still in the barn doing what needed to be done before the storm hit. Miles looked at the barn and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Probably," he said. "In a normal storm, yes. In a bad one." He stopped. "How bad do you think this one is going to be?" He looked at the sky again. "Bad," he said. The storm arrived in the night, which somehow felt personal, as if it had chosen the time deliberately. Clara was awake when it hit. She'd been lying there listening to the wind building for an hour, feeling the cold intensify, watching the way the thin line of light under the door disappeared as the snow began packing against it. And when it struck in earnest, it was not gradual. It was immediate and absolute, the way some things announce themselves. She got up. She got Nora up, which Nora resisted in the wordless, boneless way of a child roused from deep sleep, and she brought her to the main room and settled her near the stove, which was banked and solid and throwing heat steadily. Then she put on her coat and boots and went to the door. The wind, when she opened it, hit her like something physical, which was exactly what it was. Not a presence, but a force, indifferent and enormous, carrying horizontal snow that found every gap in her clothing immediately. She pushed into it toward the barn because she needed to know what the barn looked like in this. What the barn looked like was struggling. The patched section of roof was moving in a way roofs were not supposed to move. She could see it even in the dark, even in the blizzard, the slight flexing of something that was trying to remain one thing and being pushed to become two things. Inside she could hear the horses, not panicked, not yet, but the particular high-string alertness of large animals who know something is wrong. Ethan was already in the barn. Miles was there too, in the back with the cattle end, doing something with ropes and feed racks that she couldn't entirely make out. Cole was bracing the east wall with timber he had apparently brought in for exactly this purpose, working fast in the lamplight. She went to Ethan. "The roof section," she said, over the sound of the storm and the horses. "I know," he said. "How long has it been like that?" "I noticed it an hour ago." He looked at her. "You should be inside." "Nora's inside," she said. "Show me what you need done in here." He looked at her for a moment with that expression he had when he was deciding whether to argue with her, which was an expression she had become adept at reading. And he apparently concluded correctly that arguing was not going to be a productive use of the limited time available. "The horses," he said, "they need to be kept calm. Della's already—" "I know Della," Clara said. "Go help Cole." She went to Della first because Della was the oldest and the most sensitive to disturbance, and she had been listening to Nora talk to Della for 3 weeks and knew, in a way she wouldn't have known a month ago, exactly what Della needed from a person in this situation. She put her hand on the mare's neck and kept her voice low and even, and talked about absolutely nothing, just the cadence of a calm voice, the physical weight of a hand communicating that there was a person here who was not afraid, and felt Della's breathing slow by degrees. She worked her way down the stalls. The younger horses were more difficult, Copper especially, who kept throwing his head and dancing sideways in the stall, but she worked with the patience that Cole had accidentally taught her by watching him with Nora, which was the patience of someone who understands that rushing a frightened creature only makes it more frightened. She had been in the barn for perhaps 40 minutes when she heard the crack. It was not a gradual sound. It was a single sharp report, like something deciding all at once, and it came from above, and in the 2 seconds between the sound and what happened next, she had time to identify exactly what it meant, and where it was coming from, and what was directly beneath it. Ethan was directly beneath it. The section of the patched roof gave way on the east side, not completely but significantly. A fall of snow and timber and ice that came down fast and loud and wrong. And when the sound stopped, Clara was already moving toward where Ethan had been standing, calling his name, and the only thing that answered her was the wind through the new hole in the roof and the terrified sound of the horses. Ethan. She climbed over a fallen timber. The lamp had survived impossibly, still hanging from its hook on the post nearby. Ethan, say something. I'm here. His voice came from under a section of collapsed timber and snow. Not buried, she could see one of his arms, his coat, but pinned. Pinned by a beam that had come down at an angle across his legs. He was conscious. He was talking. But the beam was heavy and awkward, and Cole was on the other side of the barn, and Miles was farther back, and the hole in the roof was still open to the storm. Can you move your legs? She asked. My right leg, yes. The left. He stopped. I don't know. She looked at the beam. She looked at the angle of it. She thought about what she knew about this barn. And she knew more about it than Ethan probably realized, because she had spent 3 weeks walking every corner of it with Nora, listening to Cole explain things about how it was built, and where the old structures were, and what the original design had been before the various additions and repairs. She remembered something Cole had said about 3 weeks ago to Nora while they were looking at the far corner of the barn. She had been carrying feed in from outside and had caught only part of it, but she had filed it away the way she filed everything away. The old side door, back from when my father built the first version. Boarded up when we added the east wall. Still there, though, under the feed sacks. She looked at the east wall. She looked at where the feed sacks were stacked. Clara, Ethan said from under the beam. Get Miles. Miles can't reach you from where he is, she said, quickly but clearly. The cattle have broken through the feed rack. He's dealing with that. Cole's on the wrong side of this collapse. She was already moving toward the east wall, climbing over what was in her way. There's a door, a side entrance. I need 30 seconds. What door? Clara. She reached the feed sacks and started moving them, and they were heavy, and her arms were not particularly strong, and this was not going to be elegant or easy, but she moved 3 of them, and there it was. The original door, boarded shut with 2 horizontal planks nailed across it, old nails in old wood that had been there long enough that the wood had shrunk around them. She found a piece of fallen timber short enough to manage and used it as a lever against the lower plank. And it was not like the way it happens in stories, where things come free easily when the heroine needs them to. It was hard, and it took 3 attempts, and she stripped the side of her hand raw against the rough wood, but the plank came away, and then she did the upper one, and the door, swollen with cold and age and disuse, fought her for a full 10 seconds before she put her shoulder against it, and it opened. The side entrance came out at an angle to the collapse point. From here, the beam across Ethan was approachable from the end rather than the middle, which was a different problem from the one she'd been looking at from the front. The end of it was lodged against a post that had partially given way. If she could move the post slightly— Cole appeared beside her without warning or announcement, because of course he'd heard the collapse and had been working his way around. He took one look at what she was pointing at. He nodded once. Between them, Clara on one side, Cole on the other, neither of them speaking, communicating entirely through the physical logic of the task. They shifted the post 6 inches, which was enough to change the angle of the beam, which was enough for Ethan to drag himself clear, which he did with the particular grim focus of a man who is not going to let the fact that something hurts stop him from doing the necessary thing. He came out on his hands and knees on the barn floor. He sat back against the wall and looked at his left leg, and then at the ceiling, and then at Clara. She was breathing very hard. Her hand was bleeding. She was also, she noticed with some surprise, furious. Not at him, not at anyone specific, but at the abstract fact of the situation, at the way this place kept requiring everything from everyone all the time and offered so little certainty in return. The door, Ethan said. Your father built it, she said. Cole told Nora about it 3 weeks ago. He looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him. Kids pay attention, he said, which was not an explanation but was, from Cole, as close as you were going to get to one. Miles appeared from the back of the barn, his coat torn where one of the cattle had apparently objected to being managed. his face carrying the expression of a man who has survived something through sheer stubbornness and is not yet ready to feel relieved. He looked at the hole in the roof, at the collapsed timber, at Ethan on the ground, and then at Clara. "What did I miss?" he said. "Nothing important," Clara said, which was so untrue that Miles laughed despite everything. A short, startled laugh, the kind that comes out of you when your body is so flooded with whatever comes after fear that it needs to release something. They managed the rest of the night in the way you manage things when options are limited, and stopping is not one of them. Cole got up on what remained of the roof and secured a canvas tarp over the worst of the gap, working in the blizzard with the efficiency of a man who was not going to let weather be the most difficult thing he'd ever dealt with. Miles resecured the cattle. Clara got Ethan inside, which required him to lean on her shoulder for the walk across the yard. And he did this with the reluctance of a man who hated needing assistance, but had the sense to know this was not the time to be difficult about it. In the kitchen, under lamplight, she looked at his leg. It wasn't broken. She was not a doctor. She was clear about that. But she had helped set a broken wrist once when she was 17, and she knew what a break felt like to the touch, the specific wrongness of it, and this wasn't that. It was bruised severely and would make the next week unpleasant, but it wasn't broken. "You need to stay off it tomorrow," she said. Miles and Cole can do what needs doing," she said. "You need to stay off it." He looked at her steadily. "Are you always this?" "Yes," she said, before he finished the sentence. "Whatever you were going to say." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her hand, which she had forgotten about entirely. "You're bleeding." She looked at it. "I know." I can, Clara." He said it quietly, without impatience or insistence, but with a steadiness that made her stop. "Let me." She set her hand on the table, palm up. He cleaned it carefully with water and cloth and a steadiness of hands that she noticed because she was always noticing things she filed away. He didn't talk while he did it. The stove clicked and settled beside them, and the storm outside was lessening. She could tell by the sound of the wind, the frequency changing from a roar to something lower and more intermittent. When he was done, he held her hand for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Not as a gesture of anything, or not only as a gesture of anything. More like someone who has reached the end of a very long, difficult day and is not quite ready to let go of the one thing that is solid and warm and present. She didn't pull her hand away. Nora appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, her hair wild, her eyes serious with the seriousness of someone who has been awake by herself for too long and has been worrying. "Mama," she said. "Here," Clara said. Nora looked at Ethan. "Are you hurt?" "A little," Ethan said. "Not badly." Nora looked at this for a moment, weighing it. Then she went to Ethan's chair and climbed up onto it beside him. Onto the chair, not onto him, the careful distance of a child who isn't sure yet how much she's allowed, and leaned her head against his arm with the absolute trust of the very small and the very tired. Ethan sat very still, like a man who doesn't want to move in case the thing next to him decides to leave. Clara looked at them and felt something so large and so difficult to categorize that she looked away, at the window, at the darkness outside that was now more quiet than violent, at the frost building on the glass in patterns that had their own logic if you looked long enough. She heard Miles and Cole come in from the barn, stomping snow from their boots, Miles saying something low to Cole that she didn't catch, and Cole grunting something back. She heard Ethan say, very quietly, to Nora, "You weren't scared?" And she heard her daughter say, with complete conviction, "I knew you'd be okay." A pause. "How'd you know that?" Ethan said. "Because Mama was there," Nora said simply, as if this explained everything and required no further elaboration. And then the child was asleep, against Ethan's arm, in the chair by the stove, while the storm finished what it had started outside, and the barn stood damaged but upright, and the ranch endured the way it had always endured. Not because anything was perfect, but because the people inside it refused, each in their own way, to let it be anything else. Clara finally sat down. Her legs were tired. Her hand ached. She was overdue for sleep by several hours. In the warm kitchen, with Miles pouring coffee, and Cole checking the window and Ethan not moving because a 4-year-old was asleep on his arm. And she thought, not with any particular drama, not with any sense of arrival or completion, because she'd learned to distrust those feelings. She simply thought, this is what I fought for. Not what someone gave her, not what she'd been promised, what she had walked into the dark to find. The morning after the storm, Red Hollow looked like a town that had been picked up, shaken, and set back down without particular care for where things landed. Clara learned this from Agnes Petty, who arrived 2 days later in a wagon piled with lumber and supplies, and 2 of her grown nephews, and who surveyed the damaged barn with her hands on her hips and the expression of a woman who has seen worse but is not going to say so out loud because it wouldn't help anyone. "You're not the only one," Agnes said. "Henderson's lost their chicken coop entire. Brower family's front wall caved in. Marsh, the land officer, his office roof came down in the back section." She paused, meaningfully. "Destroyed about 1/3 of the files he had stored there." Clara looked at her. "Which files?" "That I couldn't say for certain," Agnes said, "but I heard from Pete Calloway, who heard from the officer's clerk, that the water rights documentation for this valley was kept in the back section." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Victor Hale's documentation too?" Agnes met her eyes. "Victor Hale's documentation too." This was either catastrophic or something else entirely, and Clara spent the better part of that morning deciding which. She walked the yard while Agnes's nephews helped Cole and Miles with the barn repairs, stepping around the debris the storm had left. And she thought about R.T. Marsh and his careful lawyer language letter, and the moved-up timeline and the documentation threshold that had been engineered to favor certain claims over others. She thought about what it meant that the storm had destroyed the files. If Hale's documentation was gone, and Ethan's was gone too, then the review would start from a position where every claim in the valley was equally unsupported by existing records on file, which meant the land officer would have to go back to original sources, back to whatever each party could produce from their own holdings. And Clara knew exactly what Ethan had in his own holdings, because she was the one who had found it and organized it and understood what it said. The 11-year-old letter from the previous land officer, signed and specific and clear. She went inside and found Ethan at the table, his left leg elevated on a second chair as she'd made him do, going through the supply list she'd prepared before the storm. "The land office files were damaged in the storm," she said, "possibly including Hale's documentation." He looked up. "Agnes?" "Agnes." She sat down across from him. "The meeting's still in 4 weeks, but now everyone goes in without what they had on file. Everyone starts from what they can produce themselves." Ethan looked at her steadily. "We have the letter," she said, "the original, which we found and which is in this house right now, which is more than Hale is going to have if his records were in that office. You don't know what Hale has at his own property." "No," she agreed. "But I know what we have, and I know it's specific and dated and signed by the previous officer who had authority to make that arrangement." She paused. "I think we go to that meeting ready." He was quiet for a moment, in that way of his that she had learned was thinking rather than reluctance. "Marsh is going to be... He's not going to want to honor a document from an officer who's been retired for 11 years. He's going to have to," she said. "If it's properly executed and there's nothing in the code that supersedes it, he has to honor it." She paused. "I want to read the Territorial Land Code." Ethan looked at her. "The what?" "The code. The rules about water rights claims in the territory. There'll be a copy somewhere. The land office will have one, or Pete Calloway." She met his eyes. "I need to know what Marsh can and can't do, what the actual legal standard is, because Hale's been operating on the assumption that Marsh has more discretion than maybe he actually does." Ethan studied her for a long moment. "You're not a lawyer," he said. Not dismissively, just as a fact, stated carefully, as if he was trying to understand the shape of what she was proposing. "No," she said. "But I can read, and I understand documents, and—" She stopped, started again. "I spent 8 months in my sister's house watching a man I didn't respect make decisions that affected my life because he had access to information I didn't. I'm not going to do that again. Not here. Not when there's something I can actually do about it." He held her gaze for a few seconds. "All right," he said. "I'll need to go into town. Take Miles." "I'll take Nora," she said. "Miles is more useful here." He almost argued. She could see him almost argue. Then he apparently concluded that she was right about Miles being more useful, or possibly concluded that arguing with her about this particular class of decision was not a productive use of his energy, and he let it go. She went to Red Hollow on Thursday with Nora on the wagon bench beside her, handling the reins herself because Miles had shown her the basics 3 weeks earlier, and she had practiced enough to be competent, if not graceful. Nora was in her second-best coat and her good boots, because Clara had decided early in her time at the ranch that Nora would always be presentable in town, regardless of how much effort it took, because people made decisions about women's situations based on how their children looked. And Clara was not going to give anyone that particular angle. Pete Calloway had a copy of the Territorial Land Code, as she'd hoped. He charged her 25 cents to borrow it for the afternoon, which she paid without argument because Calloway ran his office like a small country with its own economy, and you either accepted the exchange rate or you didn't do business there. She and Nora sat in the back of Calloway's office, Nora with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil she'd been given to draw with. And Clara read the code from the beginning. It was long and dry and structured in the way legal documents were structured, which was to say it required patience and attention and the ability to hold multiple provisions in your head simultaneously to understand how they interacted with each other. She read it twice. She made notes on the back of an old receipt she'd found in her coat pocket. What she found was this: the land officer had significant authority to determine which claims were valid, but that authority was not absolute. It was constrained by a provision that required him to honor any claim supported by documentation from a previous authorized officer, provided that documentation met 3 specific criteria. It had to identify the claiming party by name, identify the resource in question with sufficient specificity, and be signed by an authorized officer in the exercise of their official duties at the time. The provision had been put in place, she gathered from the preamble, specifically to prevent new officers from invalidating arrangements made by their predecessors, which was apparently a problem that had come up before this code was written. The letter Ethan had, the one she'd found in the small box at the back of the cabinet, met all 3 criteria. She read through it in her memory, checking each one. Ethan Caldwell, by name. The water source on the south pasture of the Caldwell property, identified by its position relative to the creek. Signed by James R. Hollis, land officer, Wyoming Territory, in what had clearly been an official capacity. Marsh could not invalidate it, not legally. He could try. He could make the process difficult. He could require additional verification or raise technical objections. But the code was clear about what constituted valid documentation, and what Ethan had was valid. She sat back in Calloway's borrowed chair and looked at her notes. The question was what Hale would bring to the meeting. And the question under that question was whether Hale's operation was built on the same kind of original documentation or on something that looked like documentation, but was actually more recent, more manufactured, more dependent on Marsh's willingness to accept it. She needed to know more about how Hale had acquired his land. She went to Agnes Petty's house, which was not far, and knocked on the door, and Agnes opened it and looked at Clara and Nora and said, "I was wondering when you'd show up," in a tone that suggested she'd been expecting this visit and had already decided what she was going to contribute to it. Agnes Petty had been in this valley for 23 years. She had arrived as a young wife, survived her husband's death a decade later, and stayed because she had decided this was her home and no one was going to relocate her by force of circumstance. In those 23 years, she had watched everything that happened in and around Red Hollow with the specific attention of a woman who understood that information was a resource like any other, and she had managed hers carefully. What she knew about Victor Hale was considerable. He had come to the valley 12 years ago, she said, bought his first parcel from a family named Cutler, who were leaving because the husband had died and the wife couldn't manage the operation alone. Then a second parcel from the Olson brothers, who had been in dispute with each other about the property for 3 years and were willing to sell below value just to end the argument. Then a third. Each time, Agnes said, he came in when someone was vulnerable, Cutler widow, Olson boys who couldn't agree, the Praters, who had a bad year and needed credit, he offered. She poured coffee without asking. He doesn't go after strong operations. He goes after the ones with a problem he can use. Clara thought about this. And his water rights? Agnes looked at her. That's the thing, she said. The main water source on his property. The one everyone assumes he has rights to. I've never been entirely clear on how that was established. He's always talked about it like it's settled, but I've never seen a document. Would you have seen one? I've seen everything else, Agnes said dryly. I saw his deed records when he bought each parcel. I saw the grazing permits. I've lived next door to this situation for 12 years. I never saw a water rights document. She paused. That might mean he has one I never had occasion to see, or it might mean there isn't one because he's been assuming no one would look. Clara was quiet. He's been waiting for a meeting like this one, Agnes said, a formal review, where he can come in with whatever he has and get it officially confirmed. And whatever questions come up about Ethan's claim, Hale's own claim, gets confirmed in the same process. She looked at Clara. That's the real plan. It's not just about taking the water from Ethan. It's about Hale getting his own position secured in the same meeting, with official backing, so no one can question it later. Clara thought about that for a long time. She thought about patience as a weapon. She thought about a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of formal process and exactly this kind of environment, so he could walk out of it with something permanent. "Mama," Nora said, from where she had been sitting quietly in the corner with Agnes's elderly cat. "Can we get a cat?" "Not today," Clara said. "Not today, or not ever?" "Not today," Clara said, which satisfied neither of them, but closed the topic. On the way back to the ranch, with the afternoon light going flat and cold, Clara worked through what she had and what she needed. She had the original letter, which was valid under the code. She had Agnes's account of Hale's acquisitions, which established a pattern but wasn't documentation. She needed to know what Hale was going to bring to that meeting, and she needed to know it before the meeting, not during it, because the worst position to be in was the one where you were reacting to something you hadn't anticipated. She needed to talk to someone who had been inside Hale's operation. She thought about this for the rest of the drive back. She found Cole in the barn, which was where Cole generally was in the late afternoon, doing the kind of maintenance work that never ended on a working ranch, checking tack, organizing feed, doing the 100 small tasks that kept the whole thing functioning and that most people never noticed until they stopped being done. She said, without preamble, because Cole responded better to directness than to approach, "Do you know anyone who used to work for Victor Hale?" Cole looked up from the stirrup he was adjusting. He looked at her for a moment. "Why?" he said. "Because I need to understand what documentation he's going to bring to the land office meeting. And the only way to know that is to know how his operation is organized, and I don't know anyone who's been inside it except possibly you." Cole was quiet. "I'm not asking you to do anything improper," she said. "I'm asking if you know someone I can talk to, someone who worked there and left. Whatever they tell me stays with me." He went back to the stirrup. She thought he wasn't going to answer. She was calculating whether to push or leave when he said, "Tom Haskell. He worked Hale's place for 2 years, left about 18 months ago. He's doing day work for the Muller spread now, about 8 miles north." "Why did he leave Hale's operation?" Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "Hale shorted him on wages," he said. "3rd month running. Tom asked about it. Hale told him the books didn't support what Tom remembered agreeing to." He paused. "Which was a lie. But Hale had the paperwork saying otherwise." Clara looked at him. "Hale changed the paperwork." "I don't know that for certain," Cole said carefully. "What I know is Tom Haskell is not a man who misremembers numbers, and Hale's record said something different from what Tom remembered. Would Tom talk to me?" "I'll ride out to Muller's tomorrow," Cole said. "Ask him." He looked up at her again. "Don't tell Ethan where this came from. He'll tell me it's not necessary, and he'll be wrong." "All right," she said. She turned to go. "Clara." She stopped. Cole rarely used her name, and the use of it now felt deliberate. "What you're doing, gathering this, it's not just for the meeting." She turned back. "What do you mean?" "Hale's done this before," Cole said. "Not just here. I've heard things over the years. Other valleys, other families." He looked at her steadily. "If you find something, it should go somewhere more permanent than one land office meeting." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. She went inside and told Ethan they needed to prepare testimony, written accounts, from people who had dealt directly with Hale about what they'd experienced. Not rumors. Specific incidents. Dated, named, specific. Ethan looked up from the supply list. "That's a lot to ask people to put their name to." "I know," she said. "But I think some of them will." He studied her. "What do you know that you're not saying?" She sat down. She told him about Agnes's account of the acquisitions. She told him what Cole had said about Tom Haskell, without mentioning that Cole had been the one to tell her. She told him what she'd found in the territorial code about documentation requirements. She told him what she thought Hale's real objective was. Not just Ethan's water rights, but formal confirmation of his own position, which meant the meeting was as much opportunity as threat. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for a long time. "You've been doing all of this," he said, "while also running this kitchen and keeping the records and—" "Yes," she said simply. "Why?" She looked at him. "Because it needed doing." "Wayne, that's not—" He stopped. "Clara, that's not a complete answer." She thought about how to be honest about this without making it into something larger than either of them was ready for right now. "Because this place is worth fighting for," she said, finally. "And because the people in it are worth fighting for." She paused. "And because I'm very angry at Victor Hale, and I find it useful to do something with anger rather than just carry it." But something shifted in Ethan's face. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He said quietly, "My father built this place from nothing. He dug that water channel himself. 2 summers, working at it, because he believed if you built the water source, you'd have the foundation for everything else." A pause. He was right, but he never imagined someone would use it as a reason to take the whole thing away. Clara said nothing, because this was not the kind of moment that needed filling. "He'd have liked you," Ethan said after a while. "My father." He didn't look up. "He liked people who paid attention to things." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure this meeting goes the way it should," she said. "I know," he said. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that." She stood up. "Whatever the outcome is, I want you to know that." He looked up at her then, with an expression that was open in a way she had not seen from him before, or not quite like this. Not the guarded openness of someone revealing a small portion of themselves by deliberate choice, but the involuntary openness of someone who has been moved by something before they had time to manage it. He said her name. Just her name. She went back to the kitchen and put water on for coffee and stood at the stove and breathed for a moment, because sometimes the things people said to you in simple ways hit harder than the complicated ones. Cole brought Tom Haskell to the ranch 3 days later. Tom was a compact, careful-speaking man in his late 30s who looked at Clara with the mild wariness of someone who had learned to be cautious about what he said and to whom. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, and Miles found reasons to be in the kitchen, and Nora was in the barn with the horses, and Ethan was in the room but sat away from the table, which Clara suspected was deliberate on his part, putting himself in a position where Tom could see this was Clara's conversation, not an interrogation by the ranch's owner. She asked him about his time at Hale's operation. She asked about the wages dispute. She asked, carefully, whether he had ever seen Hale or anyone working for Hale alter records or documentation. Tom was quiet for a long moment. "I can't say I saw him do it," he said. "What I can say is this. When I started there, the arrangement I agreed to, the wages, the terms, were one thing. Hale said it, I agreed to it, we shook hands. Month later, when I asked about the first payment and why it was short, he showed me a piece of paper, said it was the record of our arrangement." He stopped. "It wasn't what I'd agreed to. The numbers were different. Not hugely. Not so much that any one person calling it wrong would seem like more than a misunderstanding, but wrong." "Did anyone else at the operation have the same experience?" Clara asked. Tom looked at his hat. "Fella named Davis, he left about 6 months before I did. Same kind of thing." He paused. "And there was something else, about the Prater family. You know them?" "I know of them," Clara said. "Hale bought their place 3 years ago. Praters needed money. Hale offered credit. When they couldn't pay, he called in the debt. The Praters said the terms he called in weren't the terms they'd agreed to." Tom shook his head slowly. By then, Mrs. Prater's husband was sick, and they didn't have the energy to fight it. They took what Hale offered for the property and left. Clara looked at him. "Would you be willing to write down what you've told me, a formal account, signed and dated?" Tom was quiet for a long time. "I've got work at Muller's," he said. "If Hale decides to make trouble for me—" "Your account wouldn't be the only one," Clara said. "And I'm going to present this to the land officer, not go after Hale directly. The purpose is to establish a pattern that the officer should know about when he's making decisions." She paused. "You'd be one of several. Your name matters because it's specific and credible, but you wouldn't be alone in it." Tom looked at Cole, who had been sitting quietly near the window. Cole gave nothing away, which was his way, but Tom seemed to read something in it. All right, Tom said. I'll write it down. The next 10 days were the most relentlessly busy of Clara's time at the ranch, which was saying something because none of her time there had been idle. She wrote to 3 other families she had learned about through Agnes, families who had lost land or resources through dealings with Hale, whose arrangements had ended differently from how they'd begun. 2 of them wrote back. One came in person, a woman named May Garrett, who had driven 4 hours in a wagon and who sat at Clara's kitchen table and talked for 2 hours in a voice so even and controlled that it was clear she had been waiting a long time for a situation in which this particular telling would be useful. She gathered everything. She organized it the way she organized everything, chronologically, specifically, with each account standing on its own, but all of them together forming a shape that was unmistakable. She also wrote up a clean copy of the water rights analysis from the Territorial Code. Not an argument exactly. A presentation of the relevant provisions and how the existing documentation met each required criterion: clear, dry, specific. The kind of document that a land officer could read and understand exactly what was being said. She showed it to Ethan 3 days before the meeting. He read it slowly, the way he read everything, and when he was done, he looked up at her and said, "Where did you learn to do this?" "Necessity," she said, "and a grandmother who believed that women should understand documents because no one else was going to explain them to us." He looked at the pages in his hands. "Clara," he said, if it works, Hale loses the water rights claim and his own claim gets scrutinized," she said, "which is what should happen." He stopped, set the papers on the table. "I'm trying to say something and I told you I was bad at this." She looked at him. "I don't want you to think that this is—" He seemed to be choosing words with more care than usual, which for Ethan was saying something. "That what you've done here, what you've brought to this place, is only about the ranch, the work, the records." He looked up at her. It's not only that." Clara was quiet. "I know I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I know this place is—" He gestured vaguely at the walls around them, which she chose to interpret as encompassing the ranch's various imperfections rather than making some larger comment about existence. "I know it's not what you came here expecting." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." "Is it?" He stopped. She waited. "Are you all right?" he asked, finally. And it was such a simple question and so clearly not the question he'd been building toward, but it was the question he'd managed, and she could see that it had cost him something to get to even that. "Yes," she said. And then, because honesty had always served her better than comfort, "I'm better than all right, most of the time." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said, which was not everything he had been trying to say, and they both knew it, but it was what they had for now, and it would hold. The morning of the land office meeting, Clara was up before anyone. She made coffee, and she sat at the table with the documents laid out in front of her, and she went through them one more time. Not because she didn't know what they said, but because the act of reading them again, in the quiet of the early morning, settled something in her. Nora appeared, as she often did, with preternatural timing, as if she had some internal sense for when her mother needed company. "Is today the important day?" Nora asked. "Yes." Nora climbed into her chair. "Are you scared?" Clara considered the question. "A little." "Cole says being a little scared is fine," Nora said. "He says it just means you're paying attention." Clara looked at her daughter. "When did Cole say that?" "Yesterday. When I was scared Copper was going to get sick because his nose was wet." Nora folded her hands on the table with a seriousness that was so exactly like Clara's own gestures that it was momentarily disorienting. "His nose is supposed to be wet. I didn't know that." "Good to know," Clara said. Miles appeared next, then Cole, and finally Ethan, who was moving better on his leg than he had been but still favored it slightly, and who looked at the documents on the table and then at Clara and said nothing, which was, she had come to understand, his version of expressing confidence. They drove into Red Hollow in the wagon, all 5 of them, Nora included, because Nora had stated with absolute certainty that she was coming, and when Clara had tried to arrange for her to stay with Agnes instead, Nora had said, "But what if you need me?" in a tone of such complete and genuine logic that Clara had looked at Ethan, and Ethan had looked at Miles, and Miles had said, "Kid's got a point." The land office was in a building near the center of Red Hollow that had a temporary quality, as if it had been put up quickly and no one had gotten around to making it permanent. The storm damage to the back section was visible, new lumber, still pale, where the old had been replaced. Victor Hale was already there. He was standing outside with his two men, the large, hired presence variety, and his lawyer, who Clara identified immediately as the author of the formal letter. Hale saw them arrive, and his face did that thing it did, the pleasant expression that reached his eyes, just barely, and not quite. He looked at Clara, and then at the wagon, and then at Nora, and something passed through his face that was harder to read. Clara got down from the wagon. She gathered the document folder she had prepared. She looked at Hale across the space between them, and she gave him nothing. No acknowledgement, no challenge, just the neutral face of a woman who has done her preparation and is ready to be in a room. Hale's lawyer leaned toward him and said something low. Hale nodded slightly, still looking at Clara. Then Agnes Petty arrived, and May Garrett in her wagon, and two other people Clara had contacted, a man named Roy Simmons, who had given a written account, and an older couple named the Petersons who had driven 3 hours to be present. Hale watched each of them arrive. The pleasant expression remained on his face, but it had become, Clara thought, somewhat more fixed than before. Inside, R.T. Marsh was a tall, thin man in his 40s, who had the look of someone who had wanted more interesting work than this and had not gotten it. He sat behind his desk with his ledger and his replaced files, the ones that hadn't been destroyed, and he looked at the room filling with people and seemed mildly surprised by the turnout. Hale's lawyer spoke first. He was good. Clara acknowledged this without letting it concern her. He was practiced and confident, and he had a way of presenting legal argument that sounded both inevitable and reasonable, as if the conclusion he was reaching was simply the natural result of the facts at hand rather than something he had engineered. He presented Hale's claim to the water source and the water rights review, and he presented it as settled, as obvious, as a matter of simple documentation that the storm had disrupted, but that his client was prepared to address through secondary sources. Clara noticed specifically that he did not produce original documentation. When it was Ethan's turn, he looked at Clara, and she stood up. Marsh looked at her. "You are?" "Clara Whitmore. I manage the records and documentation for the Caldwell Ranch." She set the folder on the desk. "I have the original water rights documentation, which meets all 3 criteria specified in Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the Territorial Land Code." She set the relevant page of the code alongside it, with the criteria marked. "And I have a written analysis of how this document meets each criterion." She watched Marsh read. She watched his face as he found the things she had found. The law was clear, and he was a land officer, and however much latitude he might have been inclined to give Hale, the law was the law, and it was in writing, and there was nothing she had claimed in her analysis that he could dispute without disputing the code itself. Hale's lawyer began to object. Clara let him make his first 2 points, and then she addressed each of them directly and specifically, citing the code provisions. And the lawyer stopped after the second response because he was good enough at his job to recognize when continuing to press a weak argument would do more damage than letting it go. Then she set May Garrett's written account on the desk. Then Tom Haskell's. Then the others. She explained what they were. She explained the pattern they established. She explained that she was not asking the land officer to adjudicate those accounts today, only to note that they existed and that they were relevant to any determination about the reliability and accuracy of competing claims in this review. Marsh looked at the stack of accounts. He looked at Hale. Hale's pleasant expression had not changed, but his lawyer had leaned slightly forward and was looking at the documents with an expression that was no longer particularly comfortable. "Mr. Hale," Marsh said, "I'm going to need to see your original documentation, your secondary sources as a basis for claiming the water rights on your eastern parcel." There was a pause. "My documentation was destroyed in the storm," Hale's lawyer said smoothly, "as were your own files. That's why we agreed on the secondary sources. The Territorial Code," Marsh said, "does not make an exception for storm damage when original documentation exists for a competing claim." He tapped Clara's folder. "I can honor secondary sources only where no original documentation exists. Where original documentation exists and meets the required criteria, it takes precedence." He looked at Hale's lawyer. "Do you have original documentation for your client's claim or not?" The silence lasted exactly long enough to tell everyone in the room what the answer was. "There may have been a claim under the previous officer," Hale's lawyer said carefully, "that was never formally documented to the current standard. Then it doesn't meet the current standard, Marsh said. He closed the folder. The Caldwell claim will be confirmed. I'm going to need to review your client's claim separately, as there are now questions about its basis. Hale spoke for the first time. This is not... He stopped. The pleasant expression had finally given way to something underneath it that was not pleasant at all. And Clara looked at it and felt something cold and clear and steady, which was not satisfaction exactly, but something more complicated. The feeling of a door closing on something that had been open too long. This is not finished, Hale said quietly. No, Clara said, which surprised even herself because she hadn't planned to speak. But your part in it is. Hale looked at her. She looked back. The room was very quiet. Then Agnes Petty, from the back, said, in a tone that conveyed a great deal, and Miles, from beside her, coughed in a way that sounded suspiciously like it was covering something, and Ethan, standing at Clara's shoulder, said nothing at all, but she could feel the specific quality of his silence, which was the silence of a man who is where he needs to be and knows it. Outside afterward, in the cold, Nora took Clara's hand and said, "Did it work?" "Yes," Clara said. "Good," Nora said, and looked at the street with the satisfaction of someone who has been told the right outcome has been achieved, even if she wasn't entirely certain what the outcome was. May Garrett came and shook Clara's hand and said, "Thank you," and Tom Haskell nodded from across the street, and Agnes Petty said, "Well, I've been waiting 12 years for that," and left it at that. Ethan stood beside Clara while the others talked around them, and he said very quietly, "You knew he didn't have original documentation." "I suspected," she said. "When did you suspect?" Agnes said she'd never seen one, and his lawyer used secondary sources as the starting point, not as backup, which meant there was nothing to be the primary. She paused. "If you have strong documentation, you lead with it. You don't build a case around alternatives unless the alternative is all you have." Ethan was quiet. "Your father was right," she said, "about the water source being the foundation." She looked at the land office building. "No one's going to take that foundation now." He turned to look at her, and she had gotten better over these weeks at reading the particular language of his face, the way other people used words, the slight changes in the set of his jaw and the quality of his eyes that communicated things he did not say, or not yet, or not here on a street in Red Hollow with 4 other people nearby and his daughter. His, she thought, Nora had become his in some way she couldn't fully articulate, standing between them holding both their hands. She could read what his face was saying. She wasn't going anywhere. The ride back from Red Hollow was quieter than the ride there, which was not the silence of disappointment, but the silence of people who have spent themselves completely on something and are now simply existing in the aftermath of it. Miles sat in the back of the wagon with his legs hanging over the edge and his face turned up toward the pale winter sky, with the expression of a man who has decided to enjoy the moment without requiring it to be anything more than what it is. Cole rode alongside on his horse and said nothing, which was how Cole processed most things, by being present in a way that didn't demand acknowledgement. Nora had fallen asleep against Clara's side before they were a mile out of town, her body making the automatic calculation that the important thing was over and rest was now the priority. Ethan drove. Clara sat beside him with Nora's weight against her and watched the frozen land open up ahead of them and felt, not triumphant, because triumph was the wrong word for something that had required this much and still left this much unresolved, but something closer to solid, like a piece of ground that had been uncertain underfoot and was now, if not entirely stable, at least more stable than it had been, and that was enough to stand on. "Hale will appeal," Ethan said after a while. "Probably," Clara said. "Marsh can't overturn the code provision, but he can slow things down, ask for additional verification, create delays." "Yes." "So this isn't—" "No," she said. "It isn't finished." She looked at the road ahead. "But it's different now. Before today he was operating in the dark, using confusion as his tool. Now there's a record, an official record with the land office, and May Garrett's account, and Tom Haskell's, and the others. He can't make any of that disappear." She paused. "Men like Hale rely on things being unspoken. Once things are spoken and written and on record, they have to change their approach. And changing your approach takes time and energy and usually leaves marks." Ethan was quiet,
handling the reins with that steady, unhurried competence she had come to associate with him specifically. Everything he did had that quality, as if he had long ago stopped fighting against the pace that things naturally wanted to move at and had simply learned to move with it. "How did you know he wouldn't have the documentation?" he asked. "I didn't know," she said, but Agnes's account was specific.
And the lawyer's approach, building a secondary source case from the beginning instead of leading with primary documentation. That's what you do when you're compensating for an absence. She paused. "I've seen it done with debt collection. Someone claiming you owe them money they can't prove because there's no original agreement. They build around the gap instead of filling it because there's nothing to fill it with." Ethan looked at the horses' backs. "Daniel," he said. He had never said her late husband's name before, which meant he had been listening all along to the things she had mentioned and storing them, the way she stored things, in the part of the mind that kept information until it was needed. "Yes," she said. "Partly." He didn't pursue it, which she was grateful for. There were things about that period of her life that she could talk about cleanly and things that still had ragged edges, and she hadn't sorted entirely which were which yet. The ranch came into view in the late afternoon light, and Clara had the specific experience she'd been having for several weeks now. The recognition of it as a landmark, not in the tourist sense but in the navigational sense, the way a sailor recognizes a coastline. Something in her body knew she was approaching home before her mind had finished the thought, and the knowledge of it was so different from anything she'd felt in the past 2 years that it still caught her slightly off guard each time. She had lived in her sister's house for 8 months without ever once feeling that way about it. She was still thinking about that when they came to a stop in the yard, and Miles jumped down from the wagon, and Nora woke up in the particular affronted way of children interrupted from sleep, and everything that had been still and quiet on the road became the ordinary noise of the end of a day. The next weeks were not peaceful in the simple sense. There was too much still unresolved for that. But they settled into something that Clara began to recognize as sustainable. Ethan's leg healed. The barn roof got properly repaired with lumber Agnes's nephews had brought, and with Cole overseeing the construction with the severe precision of a man who did not intend to have the same problem twice. The cattle came through the winter storm in better shape than feared, with only 2 losses, which Miles said was lucky and Cole said was the result of having gotten them to the lower pasture in time, which was both things simultaneously. Clara replanted the kitchen garden in the first week of the new year, working the frozen surface of the beds until she could get down to the soil underneath, which was not yet workable but would be within weeks if the weather followed what she was starting to learn were Wyoming's particular patterns. She ordered seeds through Agnes's contacts in Cheyenne, varieties suited to this altitude and this climate, and she spent an evening drawing out the planting plan at the kitchen table while Ethan read across from her and Nora drew horses on the back of old receipts, and the stove, through its reliable heat, and the wind outside did what the wind outside in Wyoming always did, which was whatever it wanted. "You're putting the brassicas there?" Ethan said, without looking up from his book. Clara looked at him. "You can read a planting diagram upside down?" "My mother had a garden," he said. "I spent a lot of time in it. The brassicas want afternoon shade," she said. "That corner gets afternoon shade from the barn." He considered this. She put hers on the north side of the fence. "For the same reason?" "I assume so. I was 7. I wasn't paying that kind of attention." She looked at him. "What were you paying attention to?" He thought about it with that characteristic seriousness, as if the question deserved an honest answer rather than a deflecting one. "Whether there was anything to eat," he said. "It was a harder year when I was 7. The operation was younger." She absorbed this. She thought about a 7-year-old boy in a kitchen garden, not experiencing it as a peaceful domestic thing, but as a practical resource, a matter of whether the family ate or didn't. She thought about how that kind of early understanding of what land meant, not romantically but practically, as the difference between enough and not enough, would shape a person's entire relationship with the property they eventually built. She thought about his father digging the water channel for 2 summers. "Your father understood what he was building," she said. "Yes." "Do you?" He looked up from the book. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she thought about how to say it precisely, because she didn't want it to come out as a larger thing than it was. He wasn't just building a cattle operation. He was building something that would outlast him. The channel, the documentation, the arrangements he made, they were all about duration, about something that persists. She paused. That's what you're building too, even when it doesn't feel like it. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Are you in that calculation? He asked. What gets built? It was the most direct question he had ever asked her. She recognized it as such, and understood that it had cost him something to ask it this plainly, because directness was not his natural mode and he had managed it anyway. She looked at her planting diagram. She looked at the stove. She looked at Nora, who had fallen asleep in her chair with a half-drawn horse on the paper in front of her, and her hair sliding out of its braid in the way it always did by evening. I'm not going anywhere, she said, which was the most direct answer she had for him right now, and which was completely true, and which meant more than it said. He nodded once. He went back to his book. But he didn't turn the page for several minutes. The formal confirmation of Ethan's water rights arrived in a letter from the land office in the third week of January, signed by R.T. Marsh in official capacity, and it was 3 paragraphs long and entirely dry in its language, and Ethan read it at the breakfast table and set it down and said, "It's done." And Miles said, "About time." And Cole said nothing but picked up his coffee cup and touched it briefly to his forehead in a small private acknowledgement, which was, from Cole Ramsey, essentially a standing ovation. Clara took the letter and read it herself, and then filed it with the other important documents in the system she had established for them. The proper box, properly labeled, properly organized. Then she made breakfast. Victor Hale's situation unraveled more slowly, which was appropriate given how long he had been building it. The secondary review that Marsh had initiated into the basis of Hale's water rights claim took 2 months, during which time Agnes Petty provided a steady stream of information about the process from her network of people who worked in the land office. The accounts that Clara had gathered, May Garrett's, Tom Haskell's, the others, had been formally noted in the record and referred to the Territorial Assessor's Office, which was a different body from the land office, and had broader authority to investigate patterns of conduct in property transactions. In March, Clara received a letter from May Garrett that said simply, "They're looking into the Prater sale," and 2 other ones. She showed it to Ethan. "Is that enough?" he asked. "It's the beginning of enough," she said. "These things take time." She folded the letter. "But now there are people looking who have the authority to do something about what they find. That's different from before." It was, she had come to understand, the only kind of justice that was available to most people most of the time. Not the swift and complete kind that felt satisfying in the moment, but the slow, documented, institutional kind that required patience and the willingness to trust that the record mattered even when you couldn't see its immediate effect. She had learned this the hard way during the year after Daniel died, watching various people who owed him money and owed her explanations. Simply wait out the discomfort of her presence until she had no more energy to maintain it. The difference was that this time the record was real, and she had helped build it, and it would persist regardless of how the people named in it chose to behave. That had to be enough. And it was. Hale himself rode past the ranch once, in February, on the road that skirted the property line. He didn't turn in. He didn't stop. Clara was in the yard when he passed, and she saw him look at the ranch, not at her specifically, but at the whole of it, the barn with its repaired roof, the yard with its cleared paths, the smoke from the kitchen stove rising in the cold air. And she watched him look and then look away and ride on. She went back inside and started the midday meal and didn't mention it to anyone. Spring came to Wyoming the way it apparently always came, which was to say, reluctantly and in stages, and with several convincing false starts, where it seemed like the cold was truly done, and then the cold returned for another 2 weeks to correct that assumption. But it came. Clara felt it first in the soil, which she had been testing with her hands every morning since February, waiting for the specific quality of give that meant it was workable. It came in mid-March, on a morning that was still cold, but different in its coldness, with something underneath the surface temperature that was like the first note of a different piece of music. She started the garden that week. Nora helped, which meant that planting took considerably longer than it would have otherwise, but was also considerably more interesting, because Nora treated every seed as an individual requiring personal introduction and had a great deal to say about the various vegetables' prospects and personalities. "I think the carrots are shy," Nora announced on the 3rd day of planting. Clara said, pressing a seed into the row she'd made. They'll come out, though. Cole says things come out when they're ready, and you can't rush them. Clara looked up. Cole said that about carrots? He said it about Copper, Nora said. When Copper didn't want to come out of his stall that day. But I think it works for carrots, too. You might be right, Clara said. Cole had, over the months, become a permanent and specific feature of Nora's moral landscape, alongside Miles, who occupied a different category that was closer to the beloved uncle variety, and Ethan, who occupied a category that Clara noticed Nora hadn't fully articulated yet, but whose nature was becoming clearer by degrees. Cole was the one Nora went to for information about the physical world, about how things worked and what they required and what they meant when they behaved in unexpected ways. She treated his opinions as authoritative in a way she didn't treat most adults' opinions, because Cole's track record on things being as he said they were was, to Nora's observation, essentially perfect. Clara had talked to Cole directly only once about his daughter, and only because he had brought it up himself, which had surprised her. It was a Sunday evening in February, with Ethan in town on some errand and Miles visiting a neighboring ranch, and Nora asleep, and the two of them in the kitchen, in the particular quiet that a house had when it was reduced to its fewest occupants. Clara was mending something. She was always mending something. The ranch was hard on clothing. And Cole was doing nothing, which she had learned was a state he occasionally allowed himself when he thought no one was paying particular attention to it. He said, "She'd be about 5 now." Clara didn't look up immediately. She set her stitching down. "What was her name?" "Anna," he said. She used to make this sound when she was happy, this particular sound. I can't describe it right." He stopped. "I thought I'd forget it. I didn't." Clara looked at him. "I'm not..." He shifted in his chair. "I'm not saying this because I want something from it. I just..." He stopped again. He looked at the table. "Nora does this thing sometimes. This serious face. It's not the same as Anna's face, but there's something in the same register." He glanced up briefly. "I don't know if that bothers you, her being around me." "No," Clara said. "It doesn't. I'm not using her to..." "Cole." She said it quietly. "I know that." He nodded. He looked back at the table. "Anna would have liked horses too," he said. "I think..." A pause. "She never got old enough for me to know for sure." The last sentence landed in the room and stayed there, and Clara didn't try to soften it or move past it, because some sentences needed to be allowed to exist in their full weight without being immediately managed. "I'm sorry," she said, the two words that were insufficient and unavoidable. "I know," he said, and then, "Thank you for not treating her differently after you found out." "Nora treats herself differently from moment to moment," Clara said. "I couldn't keep up even if I tried." Cole made a sound that was, almost certainly, a laugh. Very brief and quickly contained, but real. Clara had heard him laugh exactly twice before that evening and was fairly certain this was the third time. After that, something between them settled into a different configuration. Not warmer, exactly, because Cole didn't do warm as a sustained state, but more honest, more at ease. Like a door that had been left unlocked but nobody had pushed it open, and now it was simply open. In April, Miles taught Nora the sourdough bread recipe. It was a full afternoon production involving considerable flour on every available surface and 3 failed attempts at the right consistency before Nora got it, and Miles's running commentary was patient and specific and included at least one point where he ate raw dough directly from the bowl to check it, which Nora found enormously funny and which Clara chose not to comment on. The bread came out dense but edible, with a good crust, and Nora insisted on presenting a slice to each person at dinner with a seriousness that made it feel like a formal occasion. Ethan ate his slice and said, "That's good bread." Nora looked at him. "It's not perfect," she said critically. "Miles says the crumb needs to be more open, but it's pretty good for a first one." "Miles is right," Ethan said, "but pretty good for a first one is correct." Nora nodded, satisfied, and sat down. Clara watched this exchange and felt that thing she felt sometimes, the specific quality of a moment that was ordinary on its surface and significant underneath, that she would remember later not because anything dramatic had happened, but because of the texture of it, the way all 5 of them fit around that table without anyone having to make themselves smaller. She had been preparing to leave for so long, for months, Then for years, long before she had arrived here, that she had lost track of when the preparation had begun. Even at her sister's house, she had been packing, in some interior sense, getting ready for the next displacement, the next arrangement that would turn out to be temporary. It was something that happened to people who had been relocated enough times. They started carrying their lives in their hands rather than setting them down, because setting them down meant picking them up again later. She was setting hers down. She noticed it happening incrementally, the way you notice the season changing. Not on any single day, but across a span of days until one morning you look out the window and the thing that was one thing is now clearly another thing. She stopped checking the stage schedules from Red Hollow, which she had been noting from the newspaper Agnes brought, filed against the theoretical future when she would need them. She stopped calculating how long her wages would take to reach a meaningful sum, which she had been doing since January. She stopped reminding herself, in the quiet part of her mind where she talked to herself honestly, that this was provisional, that she should not become dependent, that the stability she was experiencing was not guaranteed. She stopped all of it sometime in April and didn't notice she'd stopped until May, when she went looking for those habits and found them gone. It was in May that Ethan asked her to stay, not as an employee, not in the careful, formal, practical language of someone making an arrangement. In the way you ask someone a thing when the asking is the entire point, and the words are almost secondary to the act of having said them. It was evening, the first warm evening that genuinely felt like a different season rather than a concession from winter, and Clara was at the kitchen window watching the last of the light go, and Ethan came in from outside and stopped in the doorway and looked at her. She turned. I was holding his hat in his hands, which was a thing she had learned he did when he was uncomfortable, the physical displacement of the discomfort into an object he could manage. His hands were not entirely steady. "I've been trying to find the right time to say this," he said. "I've been trying to find the right words. I've had them in my head in different arrangements for about 2 months. He stopped. None of the arrangements were quite right. "Ethan," she said, "let me—" He took a breath. "I know what you came here for. I know it wasn't this. I know you came for something that was supposed to be a practical arrangement with a man who wasn't there. And what you got instead was a broken-down ranch in the middle of nowhere with 3 difficult men and a water rights dispute and a storm that tried to kill everyone." He paused. "None of that was what you planned." "No," she said. "And I know I'm—" He looked at his hat. "I'm not easy. I know that. I don't say enough. I keep things to myself too long. I'm better at knowing what needs doing than I am at saying what I feel about things." He looked up. "My wife told me that, and she was right, and I haven't gotten better at it." Clara didn't say anything. She understood this was not a conversation she needed to contribute to yet. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because the records need keeping, not because Nora needs a home, although she does, and I want that for her too. I want you to stay because this place is better when you're in it, and I'm—" He stopped, started again. "I'm better when you're in it. And I would like, if it's something you want, to build something here with you that belongs to both of us. That is genuinely yours. Not a temporary arrangement. Not work you can leave when the situation changes." He paused. "I want to marry you, Clara. If that's something you could want. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm asking you to know that it's what I want and to take whatever time you need." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the train station, the cold bench, Nora's lips going the wrong color, the door after door that had closed in her face, and the last door at the end of it that had been opened by a man on a gray horse who hadn't asked anything in return. She thought about the papers and the records and the cold evenings at the kitchen table, and Victor Hale and the land office and the barn roof and the side door she'd found, because Nora had listened when Cole talked about the history of the building. She thought about Nora telling Ethan she knew he'd be okay because Mama was there. She thought about the word enough, and what it had meant the first time she used it, and what it had come to mean by now. She thought about all the ways she had been wrong in her life. Wrong about Daniel, wrong about what stability required, wrong about whether she was capable of this particular kind of trust, and she thought about the things she had come to believe slowly and with great difficulty. That being wrong before did not constitute evidence that you would be wrong again, only that you had learned things the hard way, and the hard way had a value that easier paths didn't. "I'm not going to take a lot of time," she said. Ethan looked at her. "I've been setting my life down here since April," she said. I didn't plan to. It happened while I wasn't watching. She paused. That's how I know it's real. The things you plan are always slightly different from what you expected. The things that just happen while you're busy with something else, those tend to be true. He was very still. Yes, she said. I want to marry you. He let out a breath in a way that suggested he had been holding it for longer than just the last few minutes, and he crossed the room. And for a moment they simply stood close to each other in the kitchen. Not dramatically, not the way things happen in the stories people told about love, but with the specific weight of two people who had each been carrying a great deal and were now in the same place and could, perhaps, put some of it down. I'm still not good at saying things, he said, just so you know. I know, she said. I'm not particularly patient, just so you know. He looked at her. I know, he said. And the way he said it told her he had been paying attention all along, the way she paid attention, and that what he knew about her included the difficult parts, and that the difficult parts were not disqualifying. Nora found out the following morning. Clara told her at breakfast, simply, that she and Ethan were going to be married, and they were going to stay at the ranch, and this was going to be their home. Nora ate a piece of bread. She thought about it. Do I have to call you something different? She asked Ethan. Ethan appeared to consider this with the seriousness it deserved. You can call me whatever you like, he said. Nora thought about this further. I'll keep thinking about it, she said finally, with the tone of someone who is not going to be rushed into a decision of this magnitude. And then she finished her breakfast and went to see Gus. Miles cried. He was not subtle about it, and he did not pretend he wasn't, which Clara found unexpectedly moving. He said, Good, good, twice, his voice slightly rough. And then he went outside and came back in 5 minutes later with his composure restored and an expression that dared anyone to mention what had just happened. Cole said nothing, which was what Cole said, but he went out to the barn that afternoon and came back with a small carving he'd been working on, a rough approximation of a horse, done in pale wood, about the size of a hand, and he set it on the table in front of Nora's place at dinner, without comment. Nora picked it up and looked at it for a long time. Is this Gus? She asked. Could be, Cole said. Nora held it carefully. She looked at Cole. Thank you, she said, with the full, genuine weight that children give to thank yous before they learn to deploy them routinely, before they learn that thank yous can be performed rather than meant. Cole nodded. He looked at his plate. The wedding was in June, which was late enough that the ground was truly thawed, and the garden was coming up, and the valley had put on the particular green that Wyoming managed briefly in summer, that specific intense green of a land that knows it only has a limited window and is going to use every day of it. There was no elaborate ceremony. They went to Red Hollow on a Thursday, with Miles and Cole and Nora, and Pete Calloway witnessed the license because Pete Calloway's role in their story had apparently been to be present at every significant legal moment, which Clara found appropriate given the man's commitment to documentation. Agnes Petty came and brought a pie, which Nora helped carry and nearly dropped twice and maintained with great effort. It was not a fairy tale. Clara wanted to be clear about that, with herself, in the way she had always tried to be clear with herself. It was two people who had each been damaged by the world in specific ways and who had found each other useful and then necessary and then essential, and who had decided that what they had built together was worth formalizing and defending and continuing. It was also something else. Under the practical reality of it, there was something that Clara had no useful vocabulary for, or at least no vocabulary she trusted, because the vocabulary of feeling was one she had learned to be suspicious of after a long time of the words not matching the reality. But it was there. The particular way she felt when she was in the same room as Ethan, the specific quality of the house when he was in it versus when he wasn't. The way Nora had stopped asking, sometime in the spring, whether they were going to have to go somewhere else, a question she had been asking in various forms since she was 3 years old, which told Clara something about what the child's body had registered before Clara had allowed herself to name it. There was also this. She was happy. Not in the ecstatic, temporary way, not the way that required perfect circumstances to be maintained, but in the durable way, the way that persisted through difficult days and tedious tasks and arguments about small things, which they did have because they were both stubborn and both convinced they were right about most things. And neither of them was particularly skilled at conceding a point without being completely certain it needed conceding. She was happy in the way that had room in it for difficulty. That was the only kind she trusted. The summer brought work, which was what summer on a cattle ranch meant. And the work was hard and ongoing and required everyone. Clara expanded the garden and put up preserves and reorganized the entire storage system for the third time because the second system had revealed its own inefficiencies after 6 months of use, and she kept the records and managed the documentation and paid the accounts and wrote 2 more letters related to the ongoing review of Hale's property dealings, which was proceeding slowly but was proceeding. Miles taught Nora to ride properly. Not just to sit on Gus and be walked around, but to actually ride, to communicate with the horse, to understand what the shifts in its weight were saying, to develop the particular core balance that horsemanship required. Nora took to it with the focused intensity she brought to everything she had decided mattered, and by the end of summer she was riding Gus in the lower pasture without assistance, small and very serious on the big gray horse, her back straight and her hands light on the reins. Cole watched from the fence one afternoon and said nothing, but he had his arms resting on the top rail, and his face was turned toward the pasture, and the expression it wore was one Clara had not seen on it before. Not exactly peaceful, which was too simple, but something in that direction. She came and stood beside him. "She's good," he said. "Yes." Natural. A pause. "Some people are and some people aren't. You can't teach the natural part." Clara watched her daughter circle the pasture at a slow trot. "Cole, are you all right?" He looked at her sideways. "Why wouldn't I be?" "I'm just asking." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." He said it with the slight surprise of someone arriving at an unexpected answer, and then he looked back at the pasture. The Hale situation concluded in October, when Clara received a letter from the Territorial Assessor's Office confirming that a formal inquiry had been opened into 3 property transactions in which Victor Hale was involved, including the Prater sale. The letter was careful and official and said nothing definitive about outcomes, but it meant the record she had built, the accounts, the pattern, the documented history of how Hale operated, had reached people with the authority to act on it. She showed it to Ethan. He read it. He set it down. "Is it enough?" he asked. "For now," she said. "It means other people are watching. It means if he tries the same approach somewhere else, with some other family in some other valley, there's already a record." She folded the letter and placed it in the documentation system where it belonged. He won't stop being who he is, but who he is will be more visible from now on. Ethan nodded. He understood, she had learned, the difference between a complete victory and a structural change, and he had lived long enough to know that most real changes were structural rather than complete. That evening, with the first cold of autumn coming back through the valley, and the stove doing its work, and the household settled into the comfortable noise of its own routine, Miles arguing with Cole about the proper way to repair a fence post, an argument they had apparently been having in various forms for years. Nora at the table with her horse carving and a piece of paper and a very specific project she had declined to explain. Ethan reading, slowly, the way he always read. Clara sat for a moment and just let herself be in it. She was not the woman who had sat on the station bench in the December cold, though she was made of the same material. She was not even the woman who had come to this house not trusting it, cataloging everything she might need to leave, carrying herself ready for displacement. She was someone who had stopped preparing to leave and started building. And the difference between those two postures, one hand always near the door versus both hands on the work in front of you, was the difference between surviving a place and inhabiting it. She had inhabited it. It had become hers in the way that places become yours when you have fought for them and suffered in them and worked in them and loved people in them and been loved back. Nora looked up from her project. "Mama," she said, "how do you spell permanent?" Clara told her. Nora wrote it down with great care. Then she held up the paper. She had drawn the ranch, a child's approximation of it, blocky and bright, with the barn and the house and the pasture and 5 small figures that were identifiable primarily by their specific details. One with a large hat that must be Ethan, one with a wide grin for Miles, one angular and slightly apart for Cole, one very small for Nora herself, and one in the center with her arms spread, which Clara looked at for a long moment. "That's you," Nora said. "In the middle." Clara looked at her daughter. "Because you're the middle part," Nora said, with the simple certainty of a child stating what is obviously true. "The part that holds the other parts together." Clara took the picture carefully and looked at it for a long time. She thought about what she had believed home was before. A safe room, a man who showed up, a promise that held, something another person gave you if they chose to. She thought about what she knew now, which was different, which was harder and truer and more useful than what she had believed before. That home was not something you were given or something you found waiting for you at the end of a long journey. It was something you built with your own hands, from the materials that were actually available, with the people who actually showed up. Over time, that was actually difficult. It was something you chose every day, in the small ways, in the records you kept, in the meals you made, and the arguments you had, and the things you said when saying them cost something, and the things you didn't say when the silence was kinder. It was in the bread you burned and learned from, in the barn door you remembered because you had been paying attention, in the hand you held in a lamplight kitchen after a night that could have ended differently. Home was not a destination. It was a practice, a daily one, imperfect and ongoing, and built not on the promise of permanence, but on the repeated choice to keep building. Clara set Nora's drawing on the table where she could see it. Outside, the autumn dark settled over the valley, and the first stars came out above Wyoming, which was enormous and cold and genuinely indifferent to the people living under it. It did not promise anything. It simply was what it was, which was enough, which was more than enough. Inside, the stove knocked once in its familiar way that meant it was drawing well, and Ethan turned a page, and Miles won the fence post argument by force of repetition, and Cole said fine in the tone he used when he'd decided the argument wasn't worth continuing, and Nora leaned over her drawing and added something to it with her pencil. And Clara Whitmore, Clara Caldwell. Now, which she was still getting used to in the way you got used to things that were genuinely new, looked at all of it and stayed.